Mr. Garner.
Tom. How are you, my dear Tom? You doing all right?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's 100 degrees in Virginia, but that's what July is all about. We made it back from Washington, D.C. in one piece. The deer have only eaten all the peppers. They have not eaten the squash or the tomatoes, so there's hope. And but actually, it's been raining a lot. Because we had a major thunderstorm when driving home, and the children were singing in the
Wow.
back to get us through. So, when you can't see anything and you have one bottle of pop on the wall, two bottle of pop on the wall, it really makes a wonderful driving
How
experience.
many
So,
bottles of pop did you reach?
pie. We reached pie. And they started doing 0.1694 bottles on the wall. I was like, can we get to four? Can we get to four, please? But we got to pie. So what can I
I
say,
feel like
Tom?
there's some AI use case there.
I should have just had AI calculate the optimal number of bottles of pop on the wall, and AI would have spat out like the formula to correct. Actually, Einstein, AI would have given us how to bring together quantum mechanics and general relativity. It turns out the answer is pop. Who knew? Pop is actually it. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy said it was 42. The answer is pop.
It's pop.
It's pop. We all knew. What
Was
about
that too
Danger
soon?
Mouse? Can I give Danger Mouse like a 1970s cartoon? Yeah, Danger Mouse. Will that help us? We're gonna do a Danger Mouse right now and dive in. I'll get the eye
I feel
patch.
like that should be your nickname.
Oh, Danger Mouse.
Yeah.
Well, truth be told.
But do you feel like the mythic structures are degrading in
Ooh.
modern kids content?
Yes, that's actually an excellent. I think the mythic structure of story in general is radically in decline. I don't actually think, I'm good friends with Alex and Andrew. They were on the meaning code talking about story and theme, and I've had the pleasure of reading the book and different things. And I think it's very true that we actually don't know how to tell story. And that might sound absurd because we go, oh, a story is a plot, rising action characters, and so on. But that's not really a story. That might be a plot. A story has to have a mythic structure. It has to have a thematic structure. And the story has to be perpetually participating in that theme or that mythic structure the whole time. Otherwise, it's just a collection of random episodes. So, for example, when you read James Joyce's The Dead, there's a question of what does it mean to exist in an age of which is only able to understand itself according to symbols that no longer apply. So, or this kind of sense of a whole that is no longer there, and that you're forced to live with a sense that it's gone. Okay. So, so for example, when the woman is coming down the steps, he's asking this kind of question of, she's a symbol, but a symbol to what? A symbol to what? Or there's the part where they're giving the speech of the thought tormented age, or someone's playing piano, but they're not playing music, they're just making notes. Or the end when the snow comes softly down and you're stuck with the snow on you, but you don't know what it means because the character has died. I will try not to give away the plot to a ancient one of arguably the greatest short story in the top 5 greatest short stories of all time. But the point is that everything that happens in that story is part of the theme. It's pointing to the theme. It's not a random episode. There's a reason everything is occurring. Aristotle, when he talks about the unity of plot, will talk about the great skill of a storyteller is knowing what to withhold, what to show, what to hold back, what to show. And the decision for what to withhold and what to show is all relative to the theme or the meaning or whatever you put it. And like you'll see in Tolkien, for example, randomly he'll describe a battle and then say, oh, and there was another battle that happened thousands of years ago, and then not go into detail. Why doesn't he go into detail? Because going into detail would take away from the theme. You need to know it happened to know why the characters are where they are, but he'll choose not to go into detail because that is thematically unfit. I could go into Flannery O'Connor, you could go into O. Henry. So all these people are writing the story relative to the theme. That sense of writing a plot only relative to theme and withholding things or revealing things is completely lost in story today. Now it is a collection of what's going to keep your eyeballs on it. Like, that's the question. If your eyeballs are on it, then it's a good story. Well, not at all. But, shock value, suspense, dopamine, opening a package, like the name of the game is to keep people watching, but just because they're watching doesn't mean it's a good story. So the difference, but of course, to tell the difference between a good story and a bad story, you'd have to have judges who know what a story is, right? And if nobody knows what a story is, if they think a story is something that people keep watching, as opposed to something that is thematically consistent and thus stands the test of time. True stories stand the test of time. because they are thematically coherent and therefore they have meaning for every age and every possible age. But stories of which are simply what can keep your eyeballs on it, well, there's always a brand new thing, right? So they don't tend to last. So I actually think we see the death of story arguably throughout all areas, but it might be most devastating with children, because children really do need a kind of sense that they kind of almost have a mythic intuition. Children kind of do. They kind of have a sense of a kind of mythic intuition. And if their entertainment and stories doesn't speak to that, then they're going to lose that mythic intuition, which arguably most of us adults already have. And now it's almost like they're losing it sooner, I'm afraid. And so if we're really concerned about meaning crisis, nihilism, the loss of community, all these things, I think a lot of that tends to be engendered by a mythic sensibility. And if children are losing that at a young age, it's probably harder to gain back. It might be harder to gain back, I'm not sure. But there's definitely a change in the quality of storytelling.
Yeah, so I have faith that there's the depth in which these structures are encoded within us is too deep to penetrate within even several generations. So I do have faith that once given the appropriate mythic structure, humans are actually relatively good at restoring that sense of order, so long as they have enough space from the noise to kind of attune. And then I think once attuned, they actually become more capable of then withstanding the noise as they go back out into the world. And one thing that was coming to mind that I think's quite interesting is, seems like on one level we are playing around with like the mechanics of attention, which could be more about like how things are moving across the screen, like colors, sort of these very foundational qualia or something like that. But then there also seems to be another layer that's problematic. So I agree that layer is super problematic. And I was actually talking to my dad the other day, and my stepsister, she's, I think, 12, and he watches, sometimes he'll look over at her on an iPad and just watching her eyes, like the way they're kind of moving. He pointed out that it's quite, can be almost disturbing to watch the way that the screen is stimulating the young mind. So there's that. But then it also seems like, because we are in the internet age and there's like this radical political updating occurring, and not even necessarily good political updating, because often it's the politics are updating because it's a strategy of some kind of agenda as opposed to actually progressive movements towards the good. So we have this like very rapid fire shift in the political landscape, and narrative structure is what is weaponized, and sometimes for the good, to bring through new political order. But I think what I notice when I'm watching myth these days, often there's this jarring moment where someone's tried to bring in a political theme and it hasn't been congruent with the story, and so it kind of just juts out as like, oh, and by the way, now we do this thing. Like and you're sort of sitting there and you're like, whoa, like I understand that thing. I can't think of a good example right now. Like maybe it's about eating healthy, to use a really sort of non provocative example. And they might all of a sudden they're like feeding the character some broccoli, and it's sort of like, yeah, I get that that's good and we should be doing that, but the way in which it often disrupts, like you say, the theme that the story should be returning to, seems to be another layer of problem that's distinct from this like base layer of just like how the qualia is stimulating the person.
I think you put your finger on something very important. And I sometimes wonder if the worst consequence of the loss of focus is the loss of faith in that thematic dimension. I do think the mythic structures are very, very deep. I think they take a very long time to get rid of. They may be tied into the very things that make the brain work. I mean, we can get into, you can get into Jung, you can get into Bergson, Peter Chardin. There's a lot of different theories on this. And it seems very, very strange that a human being can walk in a room and know something's wrong, even if nobody has said anything, just by a detection of field, right? There's lots of examples of how humans seem to have this intersuppositional sort of structure between them. We don't merely think presuppositionally, but our thinking seems to be able to sense relations even if they're not there. And there seems to be also about something where human recognizes, oh, that's a good story, and it's almost primal. And it doesn't seem like that goes away easily. At the same time, there could be a consequence where our ability to be confident in that thematic sensibility could go away, where we sense this isn't a good story, but if you're not able to say why or explain why, then you get shut down, or even you shut yourself down. You know, Hegel kind of notes at the beginning of the Phenomenology of Spirit the risk of intuition. And it's not that intuition is wrong, but it's that when you intuit something, even when you're right, if you can't explain it, then one of two things happen. You can't share it. Two, you can't maintain confidence in it. Or three, when you are wrong with your intuition, because that can't occur in the same way that you can be wrong in your rationality, you have no way to check and balance it. So it's really important to have the ability to kind of have a confidence in that thematic structure and know why this is propaganda versus literature, right? If you don't know the difference between literature and propaganda, then you'll easily get swept up in the propaganda, not really able to stop it or stand against it. And then you'll yourself maybe spread the loss of the militarized narrative structure as opposed to actual literature. And this could be very, very problematic, because I think this is the age now where very fine distinctions are basically everything. You have plot, you have story, you have narrative, you have literature. Are those all the same? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they're different in very slight ways, but not knowing those differences in very slight ways means you're going to be captured by the AI or the political apparatus. Like, the system has gotten very good at militarizing. Like, if you're off by a little, the thing's got you, because that little bit that you're off by, it detects that, the AI can find that, and boom, they've got you. So you really have to have a very it's almost like wine tasting, right? Like, what's the difference? I don't really drink wine, but if you know the differences between these different red wines, it's very slight tastes, very slight differences that make a world of difference, right? Well, if you don't know the difference between story, plot, theme, narrative, all these different things, then when narrative is militarized against you, you may not have a good defense against it, because who are you to say that literature is right? You say, well, everyone has different tastes. It's okay, right? So then you can't put a strong defense against the propaganda that your children are getting sucked in, right? Because you don't fully understand it. David Hume warned that philosophy is mostly in the business of self-defense. Like, philosophy is primarily a business of self-defense, which is the ability to tell these slight differences so you can defend against it. If you don't do philosophy, then you don't necessarily have mechanisms of self-defense. And honestly, I think thinking of philosophy as self-defense can be very helpful, because if instead you think about philosophy as trying to get to the truth or whatever, that obviously there's truth to that. But then it's kind of like, well, can we ever know the truth? And maybe we're all just playing around with philosophical apparatus, and at the end of the day, it doesn't mean anything. Well, if you understand that it's self-defense, like your ability to justify your claim that this is propaganda and I'm not going to let my kid watch it because it will brainwash them. Like, if you're not able to take that stand and be right, if you do it just from a fundamentalist standpoint where you're paranoid about everything, that's not going to cut it. You have to be right when you say, I'm not going to let my kid watch it. Well, now philosophy is in a kind of game of self-defense. And basically, and then I'll give it back to you, as AI becomes very sophisticated, as politicians have become very sophisticated, as media has become very sophisticated, and as it's gotten very good at destroying our focus, as it's gotten very good at making us question the difference between, good content, bad content, as we're able to sense thematic structures but not necessarily fully defend them, as that's all occurred, the ability to engage in self-defense, I think, becomes all the more pressing. And then if we think of self-defense also too, self-defense is what you need to be able to use the AI well, for example. Like, if you know you can defend from its nefarious tendencies, well, then you could use it for its good tendencies, right? Assuming there are good tendencies. I know we have to get into that debate. But basically, if you don't have any self-defense capabilities at all, then your ability to engage in politics, engage in media, engage in AI well without being captured by it, I think goes down a lot. But I do think, just to return to that point, I do think we're in an age of where very fine distinctions is about, is really everything. What's the difference between freedom to and freedom from, say in an Isaiah Berlin sense? What's the difference between, taking a stand and being a fundamentalist? What's the difference between being brave and being brainwashed? What's the difference between, you know, defending your friends and shutting and not having faith in your friends? This is an age of very fine distinctions and being able to tell those differences. And if we can't do that, we're going to be a very confused people. And then at that point, we're probably going to be captured by the apparatus, whether it be AI or politics or so forth and so on.
Yeah, so I think one thing that's alive for me at the moment is the question of, I'm completely with you that there is an increasing subtlety and skillfulness required to navigate certain landscapes, more so than ever. And I think that this is only going to accelerate in the digital space. It's probably harder to perform these kinds of deceptions when you're with someone in the physical world with their body, but when it is all just an abstraction on a screen, then yeah, this like very fine-tuned ability to detect these differences seems essential. And I'm even noticing around people around me, I'm kind of always paying attention to what people are being taken up by in terms of ideas. And I do feel like there's a group of people that I know that are becoming increasingly uncertain and confused. And then there's a group of people who are becoming increasingly convicted of certain realities. And so there's sort of like, on average, most people are being either sort of taken into a descent of chaos or sort of being taken up by some hyper certainty. And so the role of the philosopher, and there's probably other adjacent roles, the question of, because we know not everyone's a philosopher, and as we've talked about before, you can't try to create a civilization that requires everyone to be a philosopher,
right,
or anyone to be everything, for everyone to be any single thing. Right. It's just not going to happen, and it's not desirable. That has other problems. But what is it then? I mean, we're probably going more into solution space here, but what is it then that, what kinds of social fabric do we need in order to keep everyone safe and in the safety of that discernment, even if they're not fully capable of making that discernment themselves? And I guess you could say that no one as an individual is capable of making that discernment. And so there is a kind of, we have to co-create and co-regenerate these structures. But I think, yeah, that's one problem, is how does the specific tool that a specific individual can cultivate, how does that get woven with the other skills and capacities that are needed? And will there be enough? Like, will there be enough people with these varying skills to sort of create these social fields or these relational fields where we have a sense for the normative?
Excellent. It's funny. I've been thinking a lot. You know, when you go back to a lot of the medieval thinkers or the classical thinkers, obviously you could be Aquinas, Aristotle, whatever. What's always very interesting is how they basically kind of emphasize at the end of the day that it all comes down to the ability to make quality judgments. The ability to make judgments and to be a decision maker that I can identify quality and then judge what is quality. And the reason I find it really interesting is because then if you also, like at the end, there's a book, The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom. I think he wrote this 89 or something. And what he was warning is that the university system no longer really had a function. And what it meant by that, it was either turning into business schools where you just go to get an occupation and, you know, you get your job and so on and so forth. Or it was becoming a place to be kind of a deconstructionist, kind of critical theory. You saw what was wrong with the world, but you didn't actually build anything. And what's very striking in the conclusion of that book is when he's trying to explain what exactly the humanities exist for. Like, why read literature? Why read philosophy? Why engage in all history, reading history, all these different studies, right? It's kind of like, oh, you can do that if it's a hobby, but it's not really something that can get you a job. And the arts, the same thing, right? And basically it was saying what had happened is the humanities could no longer explain why they existed, like what their function was. And basically he pointed out a few things would occur with that. He said, one, with the loss of the humanities, it would be impossible to form communities that are bound by a common pursuit of truth. And he also argues that the only way to have friendship is with a common pursuit of truth, funny enough. And so he basically argues that if you have people that aren't able to engage in the humanities, that friendship would collapse. I think that's actually occurred. We do see that lost connections, that there's a friend session people talk about. Because the thing is about friendship is when it's based on kind of what is good, what is true, what is beautiful, well, then you're not so drama prone. Because when you talk about small talk, what did you do today? What are you doing with your life? You're prone to get like disagreement that's personal. But when you get together and you feel like you're helping one another understand the nature of reality, that becomes a binding principle. And so for him, you know, you could even allude to like Cicero or different people. There's a strong connection between friendship and deeper things. Which ties into the second point, that he also says that the point of the humanities is to make you understand that there are real differences between people, like real differences. Like Christianity and Buddhism, for example, are not the same. It's tempting to say, no, all religions are the same. It's the perennial view. Or it's easy to say, oh, all humans are just, they have different clothing, different food, but at the end of the day, we're all human beings, right? And he said, this is not true. And it's actually very dangerous, because what it means is you don't have to make a decision and you don't have to judge anything. And so you don't train those muscles, because you just say at the end of the day, we're all the same. And so what? It doesn't matter. He says, ultimately, the humanities is in the business of training you to realize the stakes of reality, to train you to see hidden differences that are not self-evident, subtle hidden variables, and then to make a quality decision, a quality judgment on those variables. And basically what he wants to say is that the humanities is training you to make quality judgments and to make high risk choices that are very difficult to make and very difficult to live with. And he says, when you read Shakespeare, for example, what are you learning? You're learning that a man named Iago exists who can use rationality to convince you you're being betrayed by Desimonas. And you then have to realize, oh my gosh, the world is a place where someone can convince, like bring rationality to me that seems like a really good case for why my lover is betraying me, and that person's actually lying. How would I be able to judge through that? Or you read Achilles. Is Achilles, Mark Edmondson asked a wonderful question about Achilles. Is Achilles brave? Or is he just rageful? Is there really any bravery in rage? Or is it actually Hector who's braver than Achilles because he knows he's going to lose to Achilles? So what is courage? Suddenly you have to make a decision on what is courage. A high stakes decision, mind you, because if you misdefine what courage is, you may end up living a life where you define rage as courage and destroy all your relationships, right? So literature, for example, is constantly presenting you with the ambiguity of the human condition, where it is not clear what is good and it is not clear what is bad, and you must make a decision. You must judge. You must make a quality decision, because at the end of your life, so much of your life is simply decided by what? The quality of your decisions. If you make bad decisions, you end up with a much worse life. But the humanities has not been able to present itself as training people to make quality decisions. And so therefore, when the math and sciences come along, why would you do the humanities? Why do I need them? What skill are they teaching me? What ability are they giving me? They're not able to say, well, it's pleasure. Well, it's enjoyable. Well, you're learning about the higher things in life. That's all true. That's all true. But it's fluffy. But if I tell you, hey, you study the humanities so that you can make quality judgments, quality decisions, and you know the human condition so that when you find yourself in drama with a friend or drama in a relationship or drama at work or caught between competing goods, say between freedom and security or freedom and equality, that you're able to make a quality judgment with that. And if you have a society that is not trained in the humanities, what Alan Bloom warns is it won't be able to make quality decisions. And then AI shows up. Now you have to make a decision about what you're going to do. And we have no ability to tell the difference. Vervaeke was talking about this. We can't tell the difference anymore between human intelligence and ChatGPT. We don't know the difference because we don't have the ability to make a quality judgment, a judgment on the difference in quality between artificial intelligence and human intelligence. Now, because we don't have that ability and we can't stand by that, we're being overwhelmed. We're being overwashed. We can't defend ourselves because we didn't do like David Hume said with philosophy. So we can't defend ourselves. So then we're looking for the technocrats to tell us what is AI, what should we do it, and so on and so forth, because we can't make quality judgments ourselves. And so I think what we're seeing now is what happens when you have decades and decades where the university and education in general has not been able to present the humanities as a necessary field that you go in for training to do quality judgment. And now you have people, and look, Trump comes up, you can't tell the difference between when someone's deceiving you or not, so you get sucked in. You get like big pharma, you get sucked in. People can't make quality judgments. They can't make judgments on what's deceiving them, what's not, because they haven't gone through the humanities to get that training. And although it's completely true that not everyone can be a philosopher, if I say everyone has to make decisions, everyone has to make judgments on how they're going to live their life or not, and I'm using judgment here not as judgmental, but to look at and to judge, to weigh what you're going to do or not, everyone has to do that. And so, but the humanities has only like presented themselves as you should do us if you want to be a PhD in literature, a PhD in history or whatever. But if instead it said, you're human, so you're going to have to make judgments regarding ambiguous situations, and if they're not quality judgments, your life could be ruined. Well, suddenly this is a big deal. Suddenly you can understand why studying these things is very, very important. So it's very clear to me what we're seeing today is truly the consequences of what happens when humanities can't defend themselves. It's like humanities itself was not able to philosophize about the humanities to know what they existed for. They were not able to present themselves as existing for training to be good at quality judgment. So then no one took the humanities, and now we're in an age where we have to make decisions about these different things, and we're not capable of quality decision making. And you hear people like the meta-crisis people, Daniel Schleiermacher, talking about the need for quality rationality and so on and so forth. But the only thing I would say is I'm all about, yes, we need to be more rational. But, it's funny how we talk about being more rational and not making quality judgments. Quality judgments is a lot harsher. No one wants to talk about like making judgments and decisions because decisions are scary. We want to talk about rationality where we're in our head and we're able to see the truth of the reality. But there needs to be a lot more emphasis on the decision-making part, the quality judgment part, and then there needs to be a lot more emphasis on the ambiguity of right and wrong. Now we're in the humanities. Now we're in literature. Now we're in the arts. Because those are the spaces where, like, if you're going to use blue on your painting instead of red, why? Hans Rookmacher talks all the time. You have to make a quality judgment on why you're going to do that versus something else. And so we need to be thinking kind of that, like, humanities, quality judgment. I was talking with my beloved friend Paul Chen about that. And if we can't make quality judgments, then we're not going to be able to figure out these situations. And then with that as well, I just find it very interesting. Like when you go back and you read Alan Bloom, he basically is saying that a role of colleges is to help people have friends. Like you cannot have friendship without this kind of shared ethos of a pursuit of something more than yourself. That those kind of a community of truth seekers is what he talks about is very, very strong. And he said what's happening now is we're trying to create relationships with coworkers, like everyone at work. And he said that's better than nothing. But a shared practical goal is not the same as a shared metaphysical horizon. There's something about that horizon that motivates people in unique ways. So it's very interesting to revisit. I guess it's just interesting to revisit Alan Bloom in light of the AI and then thinking about humanities as training quality decisions. Because basically, we can't judge quality. We can't judge the quality of human intelligence from AI intelligence. So then Vervaeke was saying we think AI intelligence, we take it as a revelation of what human intelligence is, and therefore reduce ourselves into the image of that artificial intelligence and therefore lose our humanity. And we don't have the training to stand up against that. So I completely agree that not everyone can be a philosopher, but it can help if we broaden it to the humanities and then think of humanities as training quality judgment. Because not everyone can be a truck driver, but everyone might need to drive a car or at least know some form of transportation. And if we think of the humanities as a training ground for thinking through difficult situations and making quality judgments and being able to live with the results, then we can start to see, I think, what these fields are trying to do, what we're trying to get at. We're trying to get at the ability to judge with quality and to stand for that judgment, even if it's not always easy to tell why. Like to say, no, human intelligence is different, even if we can't say why necessarily, but then actually to work toward being able to say why, because if you can't do that, then basically without quality judgment, all the system, the state, the corporations, the AI, all it has to do is throw at you information that's confusing. And if it's confusing, then you can't sort it. You don't have the judgment skills to sort good information, bad information, relevant information. You know, Vervaeke talks about BS versus relevant realization. Well, that requires what? Quality judgment. You have to be able to judge in a quality manner.
Yeah, wow, that was great. So there's sort of something emerging, and maybe I'll try to talk around it because there's a few different threads. So one thing that I really liked, it's almost like you're regrounding the humanities in like their rawness. So rather than thinking of the humanities as kind of highfalutin uh, endeavor, it's more like actually the truth of the humanities is on the ground in our everyday interaction. It's sort of the first and foremost the practical things we participate in, the skills that we need. Even just watching a movie together, there's something about that's actually the essence of the humanities. And then simultaneously, it's like we've been set up perfectly to, in a way, it kind of almost feels like we've been groomed, maybe not intentionally, but there's sort of like something about the hyper rational, the omniscient perspective that grooms us to be confused and to not be able to make effective choices because it breaks down the social fabric. And I think there's something that precedes quality judgments, which is quality trust and quality love. And so it's sort of like before we even need to make choices together, we actually need to be able to relate in an undefined space that doesn't require a collapsing of the potential, because that's when things get difficult, right? It's when you actually have to draw all of the shared reality into a point of no return, which is a choice. And so I think the conditions we find ourselves in have drawn us away from the rawness of the humanities, and in doing so sort of set us up to really struggle with the process of making choices and also making us susceptible to more of the same, which is kind of this like confused state or hyper certain state. And so there's something about us being able to kind of relax back into the predefined state together, building trust. And then from there, it's sort of like in that space, there are asymmetries in knowledge. But let's say you're a philosopher, which you are, and maybe I'm just a mechanic, not just a mechanic, I'm a mechanic. And because we've spent time in this predefined space of trust, now we both have something at stake, which is the care between us. And so when one of us has to perform our asymmetry upon the other, the person who has the position of power already cares too much about this person to use that in a way that would be destructive. And so there's sort of like by spending time in the humanities together and kind of allowing the fabric there to reform when it is time to make choices and make judgments, it's not like my immediate intuition is that you're going to take advantage of me. So it's sort of like before anything can happen, we have to restore the trust that will enable asymmetries to exist, because otherwise the other thing that we risk facing is that no one is willing to make a judgment. And we see this, right? Like there's groups of people who are reacting to modernity, which is this extraordinarily judgmental structure in the way you defined it. And so we're very tender, and we're very skeptical of anyone who's now trying to shape things going forward. And so if we want to be able to make choices, which we ultimately have to live together, we have to prioritize the restoring of that trust. And as you often bring up, that probably begins with confronting the actual difference that exists between us. And once we confront the actual difference, we're not afraid of the sort of potential difference. It's sort of like when you don't confront any difference, there's just a elephant in the room that could be any difference, but it turns out there's probably limited difference. And by bringing that to the front, then you've kind of addressed that in a way where you can actually now start to move forward, shining the light on that.
Magnificent. Mr. Stanley was saying that the problem of the sign or the symbol following Lacan, is that there's infinite possible interpretation. And that's precisely the problem. You can see all these infinite things. So you need thinking, which is the kind of stopgap for Freud and all them, to kind of limit the possible interpretations. Because if there's not a limit to possible interpretations, you go crazy, basically. Well, that means you need quality thinking to know how to limit possible interpretations, what is a relevant interpretation, what's not. Where if you go to a single interpretation, that might alienate everyone around you. But if you have infinite interpretations, there's no possibility of shared intelligibility, and everyone goes nuts anyway. But that, again, is a quality kind of forming, right? And also, too, it would be another subject, and maybe we'll touch on it. I've been also thinking a lot about etiquette and what is etiquette, and it's very difficult now to talk about that without people thinking mannerism, like manners or different things. When really, if we think about etiquette in terms of how to create a room that has the dialogos feeling, maybe the flow is good, everyone trusts one another, how to kind of sort metaphysics, like meta sort things, so everyone is able to flow with one another. You know, etiquette has a way of where you're vulnerable. You don't ever defend yourself, but you also make sure that no one needs to defend themselves, because the way that people talk never attacks anyone. So there's no self-defense, but there's also no pain in a state of vulnerability, because people know how to talk with one another. There's never any hurt or different things, right? So, for example, like if I put a spoon down on the table and you ask, why did you put the spoon there? I might be tempted to say, oh, I thought you wanted me to put it there. So what I'm saying is that this is your fault, right? But instead, maybe I say, no problem, let me move it. There's two ways I could respond. One of them might be where I'm defending myself by giving a reason for why I did the thing, but that also can make an eggshell phenomenon where you feel like, oh, nerve-wracking, whatever. Where instead I know not to say that, I know just to say, no problem, I'll move it. Even though I might be tempted by saying, oh, this is why I did it. You actually don't say why you did it, precisely so you can maintain a room that doesn't feel like you're walking on eggshells. Another way to say it is that etiquette is meta etiquette or something, is avoiding the eggshell phenomenon, which many families are in. You know, they go to Thanksgiving dinner and everyone is very nervous the whole time because they know if they bring one thing up, someone will blow up. There's like this nervousness in the room. Like avoiding that nervousness is the opposite of etiquette. Like the point of etiquette is to avoid that eggshell phenomenon. Whereas now we associate etiquette with the eggshell phenomenon because you got to put your fork here, you got to put your spoon there, and everyone's really nervous. That's not actually looking back. It's more of the art of how to maintain an environment where the best of everyone comes out. It's just not self-evident how you do that. You see a lot of people say, oh, you just make people feel comfortable. The problem is the way you make people feel comfortable makes them feel not comfortable or nervous, or everyone starts hurting one another, right? So how do you kind of have a sense of what other people are comfortable with that you may not agree with or even think to, but you think what you don't even know you need to think and have that kind of art? It's kind of like a martial arts, actually. If you think of etiquette as a kind of martial arts, that's almost what it is to keep the room going. And if we go back to what you were saying on trust, so there's a few things. College was supposed to be where you learn that communal trust, those shared relations, so then you could move into quality judgment. You don't start in quality judgment. You get like the family, then the college, then the community. And now as you go off and you become an adult and you do your own life, you're able to make from that background of trust and relationship the ability to make quality decisions. Well, likewise, one of the skills you're supposed to learn is, in fact, that etiquette. And I'll call it meta etiquette just to kind of add a new term to the flavor because it's fun. But meta etiquette is supposed to be part of it. And the reason why is because if you come to a situation where you have to make a quality judgment, you need a clean reading. You need as clean of a reading as the room as possible. And if there's a lot of drama or there's a lot of eggshells, the possibility of you making a clean reading is much lower, right? It's like a science experiment. You want to control the variables, right? Well, the humanities, like with meta etiquette, can be how is there a controlling of the variables so everyone here feels trusted, so that people aren't speaking from wounds. So then when we as a community make a quality judgment, there's a much higher chance that the judgment is good versus bad, right? Like there are little things in all this. Like you mentioned trust. One of the greatest mistakes is people think trust is something you earn. Trust is something given or withdrawn. It is not earned, because then who decides when it is earned? Then someone is the judge, someone else is the slave. They have to earn the trust. It's a power dynamic. It doesn't work. Trust is given or it's withdrawn. It is not earned. But that's a little slight difference that makes all the difference in the world. And you have to know all of these different skills, all of these different availables that comes together for a meta etiquette that then can make a calm environment or a clearer environment. So then when you as a community must make a decision about AI, which is hard enough, you're not going to all have different people wounded by other members of the community that then kind of drips into the conversation that then gets in the way of the AI decision because you have all this woundedness, right? So there is this skill of maintaining, like you're saying, the kind of background, which is a whole kind of martial art form of meta etiquette. There's a million things into that. Then from that place, when you have a clearer reading, you're making a quality judgment, right? But if you try to go straight to the quality judgment, you're going to have an issue. And to me, also, a lot of it speaks to, like, there's a lot of emphasis today on wisdom. You know, Peter Lindbergh gave that wonderful talk at the Stoa. He was in the philosophy portal on wisdom commons. A lot of people talking about we need wisdom today. Wisdom is where we go and so on and so forth. And that's exactly right. I also appreciated about Peter Lindbergh to emphasize we should be careful to talk about the meta crisis without talking about the culture wars. Because the culture wars is the ground level of what people are dealing with, right? And really, one of the things I would say is that wisdom you really do need a lot of reading of literature, the arts, and the humanities, because it's one thing to be wise about global warming. It's an entirely different thing to be wise about the trade-offs between environmentalism, economics, politics, and then the coal miner families in West Virginia. Well, those are the kind of things you might learn from Absalom with William Faulkner. Those are the kind of things you might learn from reading the Civil War trilogy of the Shelby Foote, because then you see all of the trade-offs of these competing goods and different things. And there is something where I would emphasize that wisdom has to be embedded in a real deep, I do think, reading of, say, literature in the humanities. And that might just be because I'm patting myself on the shoulder. But what does it mean to be wise in the Brothers Karamazov? What does it mean to be wise in the Old South? What does it mean to be wise in the jungle by Sinclair or something, or the Upanishads or the Mahabharata? What does it mean to be wise in the Three Kingdoms? That's an entirely different question than asking what does it mean to be wise with AI, right? Because the problem with AI is it can be abstract. You're just thinking yourself versus AI. But actually what literature teaches you is in a whole network of a community, a whole network of trade-offs, a whole network of people who are going to think you're an idiot for deciding X versus Y. And usually the hardest decisions we have to make are moral decisions, ones that people think are going to be immoral versus not. What's a quality decision versus abortion? What's a quality decision versus, say, all of the social issue? What's a quality decision on, say, cutting 100 million jobs in the oil industry to save the environment, right? What does it mean to make a quality decision? That is what literature often is wrestling with, making decisions at climactic situations that are not self-evident in what is the right thing to do versus not. And if one does not have training in those fields or thinking through those fields, it will probably prove much more difficult to do. Now, again, literature has done a terrible job on defending what exactly it's in the business of doing. It's suggested that it's pleasure, or the point of reading Othello is to tell me the main characters and the main, ideas or so on and so forth. When really you should teach Othello, you say, hey, you're Othello, I'm Iago. How are you going to know that I'm deceiving you? How are you going to be able to tell when I'm able to bring you the perfect structure of rationality to show you're betrayed? How are you going to be able to see through me? Can you see through me? What would you need to be able to do to put you as a teacher in the story, as opposed to you gathering data about the story? Well, if you were to do that, you might be now in the business of quality judgment and thinking through, but we haven't done that. So I think that adds to the, I do worry. I guess that's what I would say. I do think it's important that wisdom not be overly associated with kind of a philosophical abstraction, that it be in the ground, like the humanities are supposed to bring people to the ground of the everyday and the concrete where you're making difficult trade-offs. And then to close, and I'll give it back to you, if Mr. Bloom is saying colleges ceased teaching quality judgment through literature, through the arts, through the humanities, then maybe then for me, a function of the liminal web spaces is indeed to help provide that ability to regain quality judgment. It's not just talking about ideas, it's talking about the ideas to know how to judge them in terms of quality, to organize them, and then to take a stand for it. So it may help if we think of If we think of the university system as basically failing because it failed in its duty to train people in terms of quality judgment, yes, part of it was helping people get a job, but the other part of it, which was the making us fully human, was the ability to make quality decisions. Then that could be another way to kind of view some of these liminal spaces, creating spaces by which to think through quality judgment.
Nice. Yeah. So it seems like in one sense, in a very kind of abstract and simplified sense, what we're dealing with is perception into expression. And there's something that happens in between. So you're taking things in, but before you express them, there's sort of like a transformation that occurs through the individual, through all these sort of layers of intelligence that the individual possesses, or I shouldn't say the individual, that the entity possesses, because perhaps this is also occurring at higher and lower scales with these other kinds of intelligences. And so we could then say that in order to perceive clearly and make effective choices, you're looking at different ways of doing that. And so in terms of perception, it seems like what's powerful about literature is that it's a form of information compression that corresponds to a certain kind of intelligence that we possess that's far more wet and warm, if I can use those metaphors, than, say, some of the scientific, mathematical, or philosophical abstractions, although I think philosophy is sort of more towards the literature. And I think what that can do is it can help us to absorb more of reality in a way that is different from direct experience, but contains more of the correspondence that direct experience has than, say, some coherent formal structure. And so it seems like you kind of have different ways of transforming this sensory motor loop. And some people prefer to spend more time with these kind of dry abstractions, which gives them like computational reducible relationships to reality. Whereas some people prefer to be out in the world where they're actually directly through their senses soaking in the totality of sensory experience. And some people like that middle ground, which is sort of like literature, sort of like narrative. And maybe there's like a logos, mythos, pathos distinction here that we're backing into. And I do think what's powerful about literature is the problem with sensory experience is that it's very temporally bound and spatially bound. And whereas it's like myth allows us to transcend those limitations without losing the qualities that we lose when we do raw abstraction. And so, I think that different types of people sort of prefer those different modes. And I think the best thing we have is collective intelligence that is drawing on those different modes in a trusting field. And I think as well, what seems to be happening is we're realizing more that it's not with that etiquette, with that martial arts. It's actually, I think we're coming out of a paradigm where people believed you kind of have to hold your own integrity. And if you don't have integrity, then you're not useful in any collective environment. But I think prior to that, in sort of maybe more Paleolithic times, there was this recognition that regulation and the martial arts of the sort of dialogos is a co-regulated experience. And so you're allowed to dysregulate because someone else will pick up the slack. And so it's sort of like, not only are we doing these sensory motor loops through these different scales of intelligence, we're also picking up each other's slack in a way where, although you might have a philosopher who's very trained in a certain kind of wisdom, they will be inferior in the face of reality if they don't have the kind of warm, embodied wisdom of the matriarch who lived her life amongst the woman and the children. So it's kind of like, there's this, and ultimately we become this collective intelligence that's extraordinarily capable of making quality judgments.
Excellent. I mean, a real consequence of if the majority of people are spending a lot of their time, say, on their cell phones or on a laptop or on screens, is that when AI shows up, because you don't have the experiences of warmth of thinking or the human, then it's very easy to then think I have no value, because the only experiences you have are things the AI can do, right? So there's a real consequences for if you live, say, a colder life, maybe, where the majority of your life is very hooked up with electronics. Well, then the majority of the time, the part of your brain you are using is the thing that AI seems way better than you at doing, right? And so that's another, like, those choices of those kind of experiences, which maybe they're not choices, maybe they're just pressures of the socioeconomic order, then have an effect on your ability to engage in self-defense against the zeitgeist that, or the thinking that the existence of the AI brings with it. So these things all have consequences. And, you know, I mean, goodness, as you were talking on choice, I mean, Forrest Landry is a big example on choice is such a big deal. You know, Ethan Nelson was talking about that. And there's this real emphasis that the quality of decisions is almost like the metaphysical linchpin of the human with the world. And the nature of the quality of those decisions kind of impacts what world unfolds and where we find ourselves in it. So much comes down to the ability to make quality decisions. But unfortunately, again, the universities or the humanities departments have not seen themselves as in the business of training judgment, of the ability to make good decisions in non-black and white situations and in terms of trade-offs and what you have to weigh and so on and so forth. And because we haven't done that, then we don't really know what we need to do. And the other thing too that happens with literature is people are going to fall back on stories to understand the world that they're in. So for example, under, like, when the government feels like it's oppressive, what do people say? Oh, it's like 1984. Oh, it's like Brave New World. Or they'll make allusions. Oh, it's like when Thanos snaps his fingers, right? There is always going to be situations where you encounter an experience and then you fall back on your humanities, what you entertain yourself with, to understand it. And arguably, it's necessary to have that mythos, because without it, you can't frame it in you can't kind of compact it and hand it off. They've read Brave New World. I've read Brave New World, so I can allude to that, and you know what I'm saying. I can take a very complicated idea and compress it and hand it off, and then that may help you make a decision about the situation, because it's almost like I handed you a zip file, you uncompress it. Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, if you have a society that is very limited in its scope of literature, story, or so on and so forth, then the options you have to understand the situation will be far less. And if none of the options available to you provide a framework to understand it, that could greatly reduce the probability of making a, say, good decision. So, for example, if the majority of people had also read the Russian novel We, where they actually design the entire world where all the buildings have to be made of glass, so the government at all times see everything you're doing. The novel We might actually provide a more useful file framework by which to understand, say, the Patriot Act, or some of the things the U.S. government has done with surveillance, or maybe different than surveillance. Or if you have, say, the majority of people had seen that movie Brazil from the 70s, kind of a weird movie, but can be useful, then you'd have a framework to understand that the government can be totalitarian because they're incompetent, and they're trying to hide the fact that they're incompetent, right? That's a version of Big Brother. Like, if you only have Big Brother, then you have this super competent controlling system, when really the government might have no idea what it's doing and just trying to improv as it goes. And whenever anyone tries to kind of point out their shortcoming, they would strongly react and throw them in prison or something like that. Or if the majority of people had maybe read The Castle or The Trial by Kafka, then you could reference this way that people naturally organize themselves to put themselves in prison in the act of trying to prove their innocence, that the state actually controls people by directing their choices, never by directly forcing them to do anything. So it's neither a direct force of Big Brother, nor is it a kind of tricking them with pleasure. It's organizing the setting in such a way that when people make choices freely, they're actually going deeper and deeper into the apparatus. And that's what we can see in Kafka. Well, the novel We, The Castle, and Brazil are three examples of zip files that I'm afraid the majority of people may not have. And so you can't offer that as a framework by which they might understand their situation. So let's say the government is actually operating more so according to, say, We. Well, if you talk about Big Brother and Brave New World, then people will be like, I don't see it. I don't see it. There's no problem because the frameworks won't allow them to compute the data that's coming forth, right? So then the government could actually control people according to we, because they do not have the framework by which to interpret the situation. So that's also too, like when you have literature, you have various like zip files that you can uncompress, framework, understand the situation. No, that one doesn't work. Put it away. Uncompress, look, different. Put it away. Or let me try Othello. No, Othello doesn't work here. Let me try a little fable. No, that doesn't work there. Let me try, say, Greenleaf. No, that doesn't work there. But if you only have like two, see, this is all that's happening now. The government basically knows the only way totalitarian is understood is either Huxley or Brave New World. So they just look for a third option that people don't have a framework to interpret, and they work through there. Like the majority is not going to be reading Control Societies by Deleuze, so they just work through Control Societies, and you don't have a framework by which to understand what's going on. So the likelihood of the quality of decision goes down by the limitation of the frameworks and resources you could bring forth by which to understand the situation. If you can't understand the situation, then the likelihood of a quality decision goes down. Also, if you had read these texts, then you may have thought about what you would have done in those situations so that you're prepared if the situation arises, so that you would know what to do when it occurs and you don't get tricked so easily, or you don't have a pathological response or anything like that. Likewise, if you read maybe Jane Austen, then when you're in a social setting, you would know how to not make people feel uncomfortable, or how to engage in meta etiquette, or how to engage in conversation so that you don't cause all sorts of problems. So now what's happening is we have generally a society of people that have limited resources by which to understand situations in very high stakes situations that they're also trying to come together in community to address, but everyone has wounds from which they're speaking out of. And then there's a lack of the meta etiquette to know how to keep those communities from ending up in endless drama and trial, and then a limited number of resources through which to make quality decisions. So all of that comes together to create, like, it's like we need to do something about AI, we need to do something about the meta crisis, but not necessarily having the resources to do something about it. Or people get married not knowing, like, say, Chekhov, and all the ways that characters who love each other end up. Harold Bloom once said in Chekhov that the secret to understanding romance is that two people who talk to one another never understand what one another is saying. That marriage is defined by constant misinterpretation. Well, if you knew that when you went into marriage, then it would not be that the person is stupid. It's that you have different frameworks by which you understand the situation. So all of these kind of come together if we look at the humanities as in making us more human, to create a shared intelligibility database, mental models, different frameworks by which to help us make quality decisions. And if we can't make quality decisions, then it becomes difficult, just like Forrest Landry talks about, to kind of bring forth a world that we want to live in. And then ultimately what ends up happening is that the apparatus make decisions for us and we don't even know it, right? They kind of just, basically all they have to do is set options that we can't think outside of because we don't have the resources to think outside of those options, and we just choose between those. And then basically you're stuck, and that can be like a command control economy problem there. So I think that speaks to what some of the online spaces can do. What would it mean to provide increasing frameworks by which to make quality decisions through? And I do think, Justin Murphy recently in his newsletter was talking about how Other Life are emphasizing reading great books. Cadell Last is an emphasis on reading great books and having the discussions. And I think if indeed we think about it in terms of shared wisdom to increase quality judgment, which then also, here's the thing, quality judgment also helps you judge quality friendship. Like one of the reasons people have trouble having friends is because they don't know how to judge where there's a quality relationship. What's the difference between a friend and an associate, right? What's the difference between a home and a hotel or something, right? Well, there's a quality of experience. You have to be able to judge. You have to be able to tell the difference in the quality of the experience between a friend and an associate, a home and a hotel, a community and a gathering. Well, those are, again, this goes back to what we were saying. It seems the name of the game now is very fine distinctions between story, plot, narrative, theme, very fine distinctions between associate, friend, hotel, and home. Well, the finer the distinction, the more the name of the game is quality judgment. And if you like the ability to judge the very fine differences in quality, and if you can't judge those, then it will be difficult to, well, then you're going to get hurt because you thought you had a friend and actually it was just an associate and you couldn't judge the difference. And one day they turn out not to be a friend and now you don't trust anyone. And so now everyone is atomized. No one's getting married. No one wants to go out. Everyone's just saying, because why? Because I thought this was a friend and they weren't. Well, and they feel tricked because the thing is, if you don't have quality judgment, then what do you do? Like if you don't have quality judgment, you also don't have the judgment to judge. You don't have quality judgment. So there's kind of a circular problem here, and you're like, what do I do? And then no one is making a point to train quality judgment. You don't even know that's what you need. You took some English classes. They didn't say that's what it was about. You've never been taught the link between quality judgment and friendship or marriage, or the ability to work through meta etiquette and different things. So then what do? And you eventually get tired. You get exhausted. You don't want to try anymore. And you see this society now of exhaustion. I do wonder if sometimes the emphasis should be on exhaustion than nihilism. I do wonder if it's more of an exhaustion than a nihilism that defines the world. And I know nihilism, I don't know if most people are like, oh, the universe is cold, therefore nothing exists. I feel like it's more, there's a lot more exhaustion than there is nihilism, of just not knowing how to figure out all this complexity. And I don't think Viveki would disagree with that. But the word nihilism doesn't always capture the exhaustion that I think defines a lot of people in this place of not knowing how to make decision or quality decision or et cetera, so forth.
Yeah, I love that. At the end there's something around like nihilism, exhaustion, pain, depression. Again, these like fine distinctions, but it, even just on a day where you have slightly lower energy, it's much harder to connect with those meaning structures, and sort of the ways of assembling patterns in the world do require a certain vitality. And so, yeah, I think that it's always an interesting thought, like what happens when you give someone like a good couple of nights rest, like how many of their problems go away, right? And then you have to ask the question of like, well, why is someone working so hard? And I would say in the world we're in right now, that is almost always, at least in the modern world, that's almost always a form of self-deception. If you're working yourself to the point of your quality of life dropping, you're probably lacking a certain quality judgment, right? But yeah, so that whole thing around like zip files and interpreting experiences through these more sort of mythological schemas, I think this is really powerful, and it kind of ties in with a thought that I came in with today that we've kind of been touching on, but I maybe want to go into it more directly. But before I do, there's also something around like not just being able to make quality judgments of your experiences, but also what you're anticipating, like what you know even has the potential to exist. Are you living in a world where you're anticipating every next move as being one of suffering based on all of the moves that came before? And if so, even when someone tries to do something of quality, are you going to miss it? So there's also that other movement of not just interpretation, but also like projection. What are you expecting to come around the corner? And what we were saying earlier around like as these mythical structures degrade and this potential of losing our understanding, or at least our confidence in them, it's quite terrifying to think of having experienced these distinctions between, say, a home and a hotel. It's quite terrifying to think about someone who's lost the experience, or has never had the experience, and therefore they can't even imagine. Sort of like you can imagine humanity backing itself into a corner where even the ability to imagine ourselves out of the situation has been severely distorted or deformed due to the fact that no one possesses the zip files of experience necessary to even imaginate or anticipate the next move. Yeah, so this other thing, so I don't want to overgeneralize, but it does feel safe to say that spirit is coming back into the world in places, like there's a way in which it's returning, and maybe in new forms in some senses, but there's places where there's a movement of spirit, and there's a movement of the unconscious and sort of these mythological structures pushing themselves back into the world. And so this thing of quality distinctions, I think we find ourselves in a time where the difference between us recreating all of the spiritual failures of the last few decades versus actually allowing, say, spirituality back into the world is going to be a very, very fine difference. And I think it's a lot of it's going to come through the logic that I think this is really a job for philosophy. Like, it's the logic that we use, it's the semantics that we apply to the stories, it's the metaphysics that we're grounding the stories and the spirituality in. And I come from a certain background and bias and predisposition, but for me, I'm worried about the extent to which the imagination can come back in. Obviously, there's a risk of it not coming back in enough, but I'm interested to explore the risk of it coming back in too intensely, where we start having this sort of ecstatic revival to the point where sort of the edges of the imagination, where things like human sacrifice and kind of sort of this very, I guess it's a Dionysian coloring, can kind of find its way back in. And yeah, I'd just love to hear your thoughts on, even just as a starting point, like the simple question of the relationship between people who begin to interpret myth literally versus those who try to take a sort of metaphorical perspective upon it. Like, even that to me is just an immediate clash and a sort of dead end between people, where someone thinks the story that's coming through and their imagination is yeah, I mean, I'll stop there, but I'm intrigued to hear your thoughts around that.
Well, that was outstanding. I think you put your finger on something really extraordinary. So a few things. First off, there's always an incentive not to judge, because if you judge, you're responsible. So if I don't have the zip files, then it's not my fault. I couldn't help but interpret the situation wrongly. Likewise, if I don't know the meta etiquette, it's not my fault if everyone's, upset, right? I'm a victim. There's a kind of victim and there's not responsibility. But if you know the meta etiquette, if you know the different frameworks, then there comes with it a kind of responsibility. And there's kind of a human tendency to want to avoid that. And I do wonder sometimes, is if you frame the problem of the world as nihilism, then it's not your fault. But if it's exhaustion, then that brings with it a certain, like, you could have done something about that. Why are you exhausted? Maybe you should have gone to the gym more, quote unquote. Maybe you should have had different resources. But if we can say it's because the universe is meaningless and God is dead, then you're a kind of victim. And I do wonder if there's an emphasis on nihilism and on that, because when you start talking about, well, the human has done something to lead them into a place where they're exhausted, in the sense of they're just tired of thinking. Well, that's a different ballgame. And everyone will become tired of thinking who does not have quality judgment. Because you get tired, because everyone is tired out by choice. Everyone is exhausted by choice, especially when they can't make any choice. Like, there's choices they know to make, but they don't know how to make it. They can't have confidence in the choice, so they go nuts, right? So then you get exhausted, but then if you go, I'm exhausted because I can't make choice, well, then you feel responsible for it because it was a choice. So then let's say it's nihilism. Let's redefine the emotion as a feeling of nothing matters, because the universe is cold, as opposed to nothing matters because I've been unable to make quality judgments to make something matter that I could then stand by. And so when you have, so there is something where almost nihilism is easier to live with sometimes. Now, there is, of course, the exhaustion of working a blue-collar job, being tired, and there's the economic exhaustion. That's different from the existential exhaustion, but they always overlap. The ability to tell fine distinctions. Where does one exhaustion begin and the other go away, right? How do we tell the difference between the exhaustion that's due to the economic situation, the exhaustion that's due to the technological situation, and the exhaustion that is dealing with the existential situation? What is the difference? Where is the overlap? Well, all of that requires quality judgment, because it's all a little truth to all of it. Well, the moment you say there's a little truth to all of it, How? To what degree? To what proportion? How do you figure that out? Well, here you go. Like right now, it's, you know, where we have, because I like Hegel, I think it's great. There's more of a dialectical kind of air where it's a little of both. You know, oh, the conservatives are right and the liberals are right, and the question is bothness, right? There's good to AI and there's bad to AI, and the question is bothness. Here's the problem about bothness. Bothness is truer than either or, but bothness by definition requires a judgment of the proportion and a judgment of what is good and what is bad. You can't talk about bothness unless you're going to start talking about quality judgment. So we've gotten to a point where we're basically forced to acknowledge bothness because of the historic epoch and all the screw-ups we've had along the way, but we don't necessarily have the skill of quality judgment by which to handle that bothness and to weigh that bothness and to determine that bothness. Yeah, sure, conservatives and liberals are both right about different things. What exactly? If we just leave it in the sort of vague realm of saying everyone is right in different ways, we don't have to make a judgment. Once you say, well, yes, everyone's right in different ways, but we have to weigh it, well, then now we're in the realm of quality judgment. So right now, you see, it's almost like a kind of cheap dialecticism or a kind of cheap bothness, where we're trying to acknowledge bothness, but not necessarily make the move of quality judgment, because one, we don't even know what that is. Two, we don't even know we need that. Three, we don't know where we would go to learn that. And four, the institutions and teachers that are supposed to be teaching that have not been teaching that. And the university systems have not. So, you know, we've got this sense now that there's a bothness. We're in pluralism, so we understand that there's a multitude. We understand that everyone has to have a seat at the table because of pluralism, but without quality judgment, we don't know how they have a seat at the table. We don't know to what degree everyone should have a seat at the table, and we can't judge it, nor can we then judge it, and then we also don't have the oratory abilities to explain it. We also haven't been trained in rhetoric to also defend or to help other people be part of the reasoning of our quality judgment so they could disagree or at least understand where we're coming from. So there's also another thing that the humanities have not been teaching that they're supposed to be teaching, which is that rhetorical ability, not to manipulate, but to kind of share. Like there's a difference between oration, because I'm trying to get you to give money to my campaign, and oration that's trying to invite you into the community of my thinking so that we can think better together. So that's another skill that hasn't been trained. That's another ballgame. But you see, in the necessity of quality judgment, when the mythos comes roaring back, because you're facing the exhaustion of modernity and you're tired and you have a sense that there's truth to it, without quality judgment, there's only one of two choices. Ignore the mythos or take the mythos as totally literal. And then you end up doing human sacrifices or going back to a hard fundamentalism, because otherwise you would have to say there's truth to the mythos, but I have to judge what is literal, what's not literal, what is metaphoric, what's not metaphoric. All of that is quality judgment. All of that requires the ability to judge. So what ends up happening is that modern life, and we've actually seen that the fundamental the fundamental branches of most religions have taken off. They've done very, very well under modernity, because what ends up happening is the mythological dimension of human beings, the spirit, we'll say spirit, the spiritual dimension of human beings doesn't go away. It's actually part of what makes us human. So if you try to stuff it down and ignore it, either it dies and the human dies with it, or it explodes back, right? And because you haven't been able to judge the right proportion to release it or to conceal it, like a good story, right? We said a good story knows when to reveal and when to hold back. Likewise, the human being knows what of the spirit to show, what to hide, what to take in myths, what to take literally, what not to take literally. Well, that's all kind of meta etiquette. That's all a kind of quality judgment. If we do not know that, there is an unbelievable real risk of the mythological roaring back on the scene as people just, because they want it, but they don't have the skill for it. So they throw themselves on it and they become very extreme. They become very like, they don't know how to think about, like when you start thinking about, let's just take the Bible. When I tell you, hey, Tom, read the Bible. Like, what do you do with the book of Job? What do you do with Leviticus? What do you do with Romans? What do you do with the Pentecost, the Spirit? Like, what do you do with these things? What's literal? What's not? You know, well, don't worry about it. You'll figure it out. Just here. Like, what you start understanding is that when you go through, like, the history of, say, theology with the Bible, why go to all this work of citing the Bible, exegesis, all this different work? Because you're trying to find a way to balance the spirit that you need with not taking it to an extremity that then alienates you from the world and other people. right? Like the problem with pluralism is everyone is speaking out of their own spiritual tradition that they desperately need, and they have to be able to figure out how to make it fit in other spiritual dispositions, and they don't have the quality judgment to know where it should begin or where it should end, really. And then they don't have the meta etiquette by which to walk into a room of people with different spiritual dispositions and have it flow, and not instead lead to overreactions or explosions or different dramas or different things. So, you know, when you mix people of different spirit per se into the same room, the level of meta etiquette and quality judgment has to be really high. And we decided to do it when it's really low. And so we're wondering why you have these pluralistic problems that are erupting and exploding. And we're really only seeing pluralism, which honestly, pluralism at the end of the day, the biggest issues of pluralism are the spiritual. And that's not just religious, but like people's mythological conditioning. They're very like deepest, fundamental understandings of reality. Those are the challenges of pluralism, not the fact that people say eat different foods or speak different languages. Those are accidental. The mythos, if you will, if you want to use that language, that's the deep challenge of pluralism. And we absolutely run the risk of when people don't have the skills, the quality judgment, the meta etiquette to organize and to think those throughs, then absolutely people take the mythological as extremely literal and they return to it. Because here's the thing. Even if it, like you mentioned, human sacrificing, and that can sound crazy, but there are lots of people that engage in some of the pagan things that go back to it because, you know, and there are forms of human sacrifice in all of human history. Well, you can at least say, it's not my fault. They did it. I look to the past. I'm looking for an identity. How do you know it's wrong? Maybe it's just like neoliberal totalitarianism that's saying we shouldn't do it. What's your basis for human dignity anyway? Like, you know, it's a crazy example, but the point is that it's not a crazy example in the sense that human beings, if they are totally groundless and they are desperate to get some sort of footing, and you've unleashed rationality unbound by any sort of first principles, then who knows what human beings will do in order to regain a sense of grounding or connection. And unfortunately, by the time you find out, it might be too late. So not having these abilities can be very consequential. You are absolutely at risk of an explosion of the revenge of the mythos. If you know, Cadell talks about the revenge of philosophy. I think that's very true. That's what we're seeing. Well, if philosophy comes roaring back and says you need these skills, and we're like, no, we don't, well, then the next thing that comes roaring back is the mythos or the spirit that will not be put out. It will, and then I'll give it back to you. Like if AI is about to cause mass unemployment, you will see an explosion of people that go back to the spiritual looking for significance, who may not have the skills to bring it into the modern condition in anything but a very crude form or very blunt form that causes all sorts of social issues. You could argue this is a part of Duginism. You could argue that this is already happening all the world, a reassertion of a prior national identity, a prior spiritual identity, a prior meta dimension. And that's only going to greatly intensify if you have AI come about with mass unemployment or dislocating the human being. So I think you put your finger on something very, very important. And you see, then also, if we keep saying that the main problem is nihilism, which I don't disagree is a problem, if instead you understand that it's exhaustion, well, then you kind of say, well, there is something we can do about it. We just have to get better at these abilities. Maybe not all at once, but we have to reorganize life so we're not so exhausted. Then there is something we can do to maybe get ready or better prepared for this revenge of the mythological, if you will, this revenge of spirit, which when it shows up, if we don't have this change of thinking now, we won't be ready for it. The likelihood of us being ready for it will be much, much, much lower. So I think what you put your finger on is very important.
Yeah, and I wonder, so if nihilism is depression, is the excess of mythology just mania? So it's sort of like this, you can kind of strip away some of the meaning and just look at the energetic state of the being. Like someone doesn't perform human sacrifice unless they're pretty aroused, right?
Sure.
Arousal in the technical sense,
sure.
Hopefully not in the other sense, although maybe. But yeah, so I think like, as you were talking, I was sort of feeling right now, there's just something about, there's something about just like how everything is being held. And on the one hand, we're trying to hold things in a way as not to squeeze them, but also not feel like there's anything sort of around them holding them. but I'm hearing as well that that's not quite enough, because although we can do this kind of broad stroke of trying to get this like appropriate way of constraint versus sort of openness, there's also, when it comes to making choices, the need for a very fine-grained, subtle perception and discernment. And it almost, in a way, feels like that's what's next. Like we've been getting a sense for this both and really kind of opening up the space for multiple perspectives and the plurality. But now it's like, oh, there's actually more to do. And that's now that the etiquette is back, we have to start making difficult choices, and that's going to require a subtler form of how we are slicing up these objects of perception that we're drawing in. Yeah, and there's what you said around like seems like the pluralism is most rampant in the abstract or in the mythical or in the identity space, but when you really come down to the physical, it almost gives us a kind of an anchoring point in that some of the kind of material conditions of our life they're just not disputable.
Right.
And maybe they are currently disputable because we're so removed from them, in a sense, in our luxury. I know we're not really living in luxury, but we've escaped a lot of the things that actually anchor us in a kind of sameness, but only temporarily. Because if we remain untethered from that for too long, then we'll come crashing back down. Yeah, and so I think in order for us to make this next move, it will actually require coming out of the digital and sort of taking what we are learning and then actually applying it in to the material around us and the relationships around us. And I don't feel like the digital will ever possess the finality, if I can say that, to hold us to making those choices. And we talked about this in one of our previous conversations around the right relationship between the digital and the physical, and then the needing to use the digital to see the beauty in the physical, but to return to that. And maybe there's a subtle fear there around when we are confronted by when we have to face the lack of mythos in the real, we might be scared back into the digital. It's sort of like the imaginary thrives in the plurality that is the digital, but when we get into the physical, it's kind of just the real. You know, it's like, and I think maybe it's increasingly the real and the physical because so much of our imaginary and symbolic has been sort of outcasted into the digital. And maybe in a way we sort of, it's not as apparent to us how the imaginary fits into the physical anymore.
I think that's very good. I think there's definitely so a few things. I think pluralism, like what you see is an explosion of the religious sentiment coming back, not going away. You see an explosion of interest in things like fields, psychedelics, empathy, these kind of ways that humans are connected that would be associated before with religion. Because the thing is, if that's all humans have left, like with AI and technology growing back, then what are we? What do we do? What is the quality that humans bring to reality that other things do not? And it seems to have a lot to do with these different things. Could ChatGPT have a psychedelic trip or something, right? You would say probably not. And if it can't, then that's an entire reality that humans are able to think and speak on that AI could not, right? So what are experiences that it's doubtful AI could have that then maybe humans could bring to AI to think about that, but AI could not do itself, right? And you probably would get into things like mystical experiences, experiences of beauty, psychedelics, dialogos, all these things that humans can do that seemingly have something to do with relations and fields and all of that, that AI cannot. So all of that is going to come erupting back. And it almost does seem as if somehow, maybe if we want to talk about a subconscious thing, like the internet almost is like preparation for that. Like almost like from a subconscious standpoint, it's like, oh, we need a place to regain the imaginary and to regain sort of an emphasis on this. Because what are we doing right now? This is all pure relation. There's no space. This is all a kind of like very spiritual kind of thing. My voice is like transferring to also like New Zealand, like a different part of the world, right? It's like magic. So there's a lot of things about the internet and technology in general that kind of border on magic, that kind of border on kind of spiritual skills and different things, but it's not quite, but it's also kind of putting them in your subconscious mind to be like, it's not so strange, is it? I mean, look what we can do with technology. Like, 500 years ago, this would be magic, right? Now it's technology. So like a lot of things are spiritual abilities. And also like tongues was weird. And now you can listen to native, like different languages easily all around the world, right? You can have experiences of tongues kind of thrown at you where, in the book of Acts, tongues, like hearing a language you didn't know at all would have been a very foreign thing. So there's all these things that now the internet almost as a like preparation for the age where the humans will have to really focus on the religious or the mythos or the spiritual is like now ready to capture you. Now, if I were to be like a Hegelian and say, well, yes, because the universe makes the whatever we will need in the explicit lurks in the implicit to be realized at the time, not in a kind of fatalist way, but just probability, just kind of emerges really. And then the question is, do we use it or not? And so there is, I think, a very real sense in which there will be that explosion of religion. And then another field of it is all of that also speaks to so much of like religious skills or metaphysical skills or all these different skills with different mystical terms has a lot to do with judgment and choice. Like it has a lot to choose to learn them. The world won't give you these things, right? You have to choose them and choose them even when they're invisible until you work them and train them into reality, right? Like the world won't give you a relationship. You have to learn to get good at it. Or, the fields, the world won't give you fields ability. You have to choose it and then work to make it real, right? You have to choose it and then work at it in different things. And it would seem like you're saying, I don't think the digital, it's like the digital is going to be the place that teaches you how to make quality decisions and how to engage in these meta skills that then you bring to the analog and the real. Then you do that work, then you go back to the digital and you go back and forth, where what we must do is have the relation between the digital and the analog be an enhancement of quality. Like if we're trying to like quantify reality in terms of the digital or quantify the digital in terms of the reality, it's going to be a civil war and everyone will lose. But if we think of it as instead, both of them provide a quality of life that the other cannot, and the other is training to bring one to the other, and the human is in the business of making the relation between the two realms optimal, in the same way that you could say humans were in the business of making the relation between spirit and earth optimal, heaven and earth optimal, and then we either became overly materialistic or overly spiritual in a disembodied way. The question is how to be the bridge between the two worlds, and the human being would seem to need to do that with digital and analog. And really the key way to me that you're that bridge is it's hard to imagine that unless you think training of judgment, training of choice. Like if you're like, oh, well, what does it mean to bring the digital to the real? I don't know what that means. Like quantify it. It seems like the digital is going to replace the real in terms of economics. The AI is going to do all this stuff better than human beings. So what do you mean? But if you say, no, it's the training ground for the quality of human decision that will be then brought to the analog, which will then give you experimentation to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You can see how they have a mutual reinforcing of on one another to help enhance the quality of decision. And I just want to emphasize, and then I'll get back to you, I think absolutely this phase of bothness, I guess in spiral dynamics or integral theory, I never know which is green, coming to term with paradox, integrating with bothness, seeing value in everything. That's a very, very important skill. But the next phase is the subtle, will require the subtlety of judgment. It will require this sort of, that's not very subtle, is it? That's just a loud sneeze. Yeah, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. So the next phase, and I do, like, we've so much kind of moralized bothness. Like bothness, I think the movement to judgment is notably difficult because that's going to require boundaries, exclusivity, right and wrong. It's like in spiral dynamics, I do think that the phase after always entails like the opposite of the previous phase. So what comes after green will probably have to be, not that I'm an expert on any of this, it will actually have to be a bit of a return to, I guess, blue or something, like this kind of more like orange, okay, this kind of groundedness. And so it's going to be the subtlety of decision making to actually maintain the difference so that it doesn't eat itself. Like we've come to appreciate difference. That's a huge step. That's a huge step in conscious evolution, if you will, because we tended not to. But now we have to learn how to hold the difference together in a manner that is not, say, immoral or unoptimal or confusing. I mean, that's the big problem with green, right? Confusion, not knowing what to do. And instead what you do is just kind of enjoy the difference, not having to, like every time green people go to make organizations, they seem to blow up, right? They don't tend to do very well, or it becomes quite a struggle because that requires decision. That requires the real. That requires saying, yes, you're different, but it's not going to work for this situation and we're going to go bankrupt. Well, now you're judging. Now you're a bad person. So that is the next phase, in my opinion. For Hegel, that's kind of speculative knowing. And look, Aquinas, all these people, like the acknowledgement of like learning how to think through situations is for that final choice of the judgment of the good, the judgment of the true, the beautiful, and the good. That's very hard because that's when you make enemies. That's when you make people upset, or that's when you're scared. That's when you're afraid, what if I do something wrong? So definitely I concur that the next phase has something to do with the subtlety of judgment and then the art of going about judgment. Because if I just come up and say, Tom, we're doing X, it's not very subtle and it's not very good meta etiquette. Now you're mad at me. Like, how do I walk up and be like, Tom, talk, X, present rhetoric or oration, bring you on board with X, where even if you say, well, I don't agree with X, but I can still, in good faith, let you know I don't agree with X, but then I can also help you on X and know I'm not betraying my own values because I understand that this will only work if we find times where we go with your decision or I go with your decision and know how to integrate in that sort of art. So all of those skills are going to be massive, and I think it's going to be very difficult for green. I think it will be very difficult for green. I think it's difficult for green right now. And I think it's especially difficult without the training from literature, the humanities that kind of train that subtlety of decision, because how do you make a subtlety decision without a profound awareness of the history of tragedy, trade-offs of competing goods, without a profound sense of the ethical dilemmas that you find characters wrapped up in throughout literature? So I think you're exactly right.
Yeah, and perhaps one of the challenges in that for green is that it gets discovered that a lot of not all of it, and not to say it isn't of value because it absolutely is, but a lot of the inclusion was actually a coping.
Yes.
It was a way of being that kept them from having to let people down, hurt people, say this and not that. And I think a lot of that inclusivity energy is actually an escape from the real, in a sense. And I think the people who are going to be able to make subtle discernments on the other side of inclusivity are the people who realize that while the mythic structures are inspiring and they help us to assemble experiences in a way that is intelligible, they ultimately aren't real. And therefore, our attempts to create them and to become that are always going to fall short. And I think if you don't get that and you don't feel that and live that in every moment, then you either turn into a cold asshole who just says, to hell with it, I'm just going to do what I want to do because, like, Romeo and Juliet isn't real, like that. Well, actually, maybe Romeo and Juliet is real, and so we won't go into that story, but the story where the lovers get together and live happily ever after, it's not real, so I'm just going to extract on the world. Or you become the person who is always accommodating because there's just this deep yearning to realize the mythic potential, but in doing so, you inevitably burn yourself out, and then you get resentful. So you either hate the world or the world hates you if you don't realize that the mythic structures are ultimately not real, but are useful and necessary.
Oh, I think both of those are the great temptations. And because you don't have to judge either way. And once you have to judge, then you're also responsible for the judgment. If I can just say, oh, there's no love stories where people turn out, then I'm not responsible for my marriage not turning out. And if I can also say it's also then rational just to extract everything. Yeah, you're not an immoral a-hole that's destroying the first future. You're just being rational, right? Like we're always looking for things to outsource our decision, right? Because I can just say, it's just rational to get the most profit, whatever, because there's no such thing as true love. Right? But I didn't actually do a scientific experiment to find out that there's no such thing as true love. I just decided that there wasn't, right? So that's the thing. If you can't do quality judgments, you still make judgments. That's the problem. And then the judgments you make tend to be non-systematic, not thought out, and they tend to have a lot of unintended consequences, right? But you see, the great thing that we have to kind of see coming down the line, and I guess after green is coral or something, and I'm not sure of the difference of coral or green, or maybe coral is integral theory and green is spiral dynamics. I'm never
Green
sure.
spiral dynamics, and yellow comes after that, which is like systems thinking.
Yeah, so there's a lot of systems thinking. Okay, but that's another thing. You're just thinking about systems for paradise. There's no system you can make that isn't a tribe without quality judgment. Like every system people are making are just tribes. But they talk about them as a system. Well, until you incorporate the person, a system is no more a system than to the degree it can incorporate in it the person who thinks the system is stupid, and it still works. A system that requires everyone to buy into the system is a tribe. A system works even if nobody agrees with it. That's why it's a system. That's also why it's tyrannical, because you don't have to agree with it for it to work. But if it's a system as opposed to a tribe, then there has to be people the system has to work for people who don't agree with it. And that's where you end up creating something like capitalism that will extract even if you don't want it to extract. But then capitalism will also provide a plumber, even if you think capitalism is dumb and you need a plumber, right? This is the difficult thing. And to create a system like that, then you have to make judgments that not everyone agrees on, and yet it somehow still works around things. Like right now, a lot of what people are calling systems is just an umbrella for the bothness. It's just an umbrella, like a category to include the bothness under. But once you get to the place of the quality judgments of how to maintain the system, that's where stuff gets tricky. So let me give an example. Jim Rutt was having a conversation with Owen Cox and Daniel Fraga, and I really enjoyed the conversation. I thought it was great for Mr. Rutt, a founder of Game B and all that different things. He was talking with them. And he was basically saying, oh, in Game B, there's going to be a lot of pluralism. There's going to be a lot of difference, and people can do different things. And maybe you're in favor of monogamy, and someone else is polyamory. Someone's against pornography. Someone else, you can do these differences. So then the first question becomes, okay, well, what's the difference between Game B and the world that already exists? I mean, the world that already exists is one where people do different things, and so on and so forth. You say, well, the difference is because we agree that competition is not good. But then they were kind of pushing back. They were saying, well, you mean there's going to be no competition at all? And Jim Rohn was like, well, there's not going to be this kind of primordial, vicious, prideful competition. Whatever competition exists is going to be ultimately collaborating in nature, right? You say, okay, collaborating in nature. What's the principles that make this competition different than, say, the competition that already exists in Game A, right? You see where we're going. Well, one of the things that Jim Rupp mentioned is, well, we can all agree that we have to have a sustainable relationship with planet Earth, right? That's kind of one of the principles that's different between Game B and Game A. Here's the problem. That sounds so self-evident, doesn't it? It sounds so obvious that who in the world could disagree between the need for human beings to have a sustainable relationship with the Earth, right? It sounds completely impossible to disagree with. But Daniel Fraga kind of pushed back, because here's the issue. There's not a single person probably on planet Earth who would disagree with that. The problem is people disagree on what that means. So, for example, I in my stock portfolio have, let's say, for example, in my retirement fund, I have ExxonMobil, Chevron, and another gas company. And you think that's really immoral because I'm profiting from extracting it. And I say it's not immoral because I'm not working for the business and I'm not sending the money. I just own the stock. And by the way, I didn't even choose the Roth IRA. That was done by Charles Schwab or Vanguard or whatever, right? But you think I'm a monster. You think I am like the worst person on planet Earth. So now a quality judgment is needed. Is it, in fact, contributing to the destruction of planet Earth and against the values of Game B to have ExxonMobil in your retirement fund? Yes or no? Who decides? By what principles? Oh, crap. All right. I drive a car. It uses gas. You use an electric vehicle. You see I have enough money in my account to go buy an electric vehicle, and I do not go buy the electric vehicle. And I think it's okay because I need that money to take care of my family. So I need to have savings. You say, well, you're acting out of worry. You will have the money if you keep, Game B will provide it or whatever, and you need to sell that gas guzzler right now and get an electric vehicle. I don't think it's immoral. Because I also am planning, I'm like, I understand in 5 years, I'll get an electric vehicle, right? I'm not going to do it right now. And you're like, no, you need to do it immediately. And I'm being like, I'm doing the best I can and you're not appreciating it. Quality judgment time. Do I need to sell my gas car immediately and get an electric vehicle? Or is it okay to wait 5 years? And is it immoral to have money in the bank that I'm saving that could pay for an electric vehicle because I'm supporting my family? Because am I not putting the well-being of my family above the well-being of the human race? Yes? No? Real disagreements are moral disagreements. Those are the ones that make or break the world. And the moral disagreements require quality judgment. And we are not ready at all to make those quality judgments because they're the ones that could cause an American civil war. They could cause us not to give, Ukraine and Russia. Like all of these are moral disputes. And the moment you assert a moral principle that makes Game B unlike Game A, that right there, only can last if you can make quality judgments about things that have no self-evident answer. And so this is it. Yellow is trying to make systems where they will only last or work or be something more than extracurricular activities if they're able to make quality decisions about moral issues. And I don't think they know that. I don't think they're aware of that. It would be an entirely another issue, but basically, I do think studying something like a bunch of the civil wars that nations have gone through, the revolutionary wars, which are basically almost always moral disputes. Not always, they can be resource limitation, but then that's moral because you're not giving us food, right? So these are the things you have to look at and think through if you're going to be talking about alternatives to Game A. Because the way to look at Game A is the management of the problem of moral disputes, where people don't know or can't make quality decisions about them because the average person won't be a philosopher or do the humanities or so on and so forth. So you create a Game A situation that can mitigate the damages of those moral disputes, however imperfectly. If you're going to replace Game A with Game B, that by definition requires the ability to make quality judgments, which you could argue has never happened in the human race, really. The majority of people have never been but so good to do that. Maybe they've done it decentralized and it's been more contained, but it's always been very difficult. So maybe there's something, and then I'll give it back to you. Maybe there's something here where the existence of the internet is the implicit being made explicit to make a training ground for the ability to get better at quality judgment. So it actually does become possible to have something like a Game B that would only work on the systems level if people can make quality judgments, stand by them, and then invite the person who you just made sell their retirement fund to Exxon still feel part of the group. Like, can you make a situation where I then convince you, you go, hey, I know ExxonMobil's in your retirement fund, but I would like you to sell that and let me convince you why. And you are actually brought on board without being made to feel like you were a monster for doing that for 5 years or something, right? Do you have the meta etiquette to bring that person back into the group or to create a way for that person to move out of that retirement fund and still be part of your organization? Because if you say, no, we have to excommunicate them, well, that means there's still a Game A out there that they can go to, right? So you haven't solved the problem. So this only works if the Game B, for example, has a way to reintroduce the immoral person back into the system in a manner that does not make them feel like a black sheep. What are those skills? That sounds like meta etiquette. That sounds like quality judgment. That sounds like people who are very familiar with the fact that reality is inherently tragic, a trade-off of competing goods. So when people make mistakes, we're not surprised by it, and we have the meta etiquette to reintroduce that person into the group. These are all the skills that would be required, and perhaps the internet is this arena, this place, this training ground that has emerged precisely so that more and more people can be good at these things to make possible these alternatives, because maybe indeed without this alternative, the meta crisis just blows up or something like that. But these are the kind of skills, I think, this is the kind of thing that has to be taken quite seriously if you're really going to put your finger on what is required for an alternative way of doing things, because an alternative way of doing things must be able to deal with moral disputes, ergo quality judgment, ergo the meta skills to then handle those moral disputes. And that if yellow is to then actually create successful systems as opposed to umbrellas for bothness and difference, I think it would have to engage in that.
Nice. What's coming to mind is, we have people who really want to put all of this on the individual, onto the person to bear the weight of that. And then we have people who want to put all of the weight on a system. And now we're acknowledging that there are people who realize it's a both and then we're going a step further, which is like, it's both and, but we have to do this quality judgment and the subtle discernment on the tension between these different scales. And so scales is really interesting to me in the sense of all the way from the like metaphysical down to the like going to the local market or the local meeting house or something like that. I think what makes all of this particularly interesting and particularly tricky is even when we do our absolute best in sort of abstract discourse online, we're still a million miles away from the nuance and the subtleties of not just the everyday experience, but also just the different layers of choice making that needs to take place. And so what kind of feels like a nice image is just right now there is a speed that is present in the flow of life, and it's getting faster. And what that speed is demanding of us is a complexification. And it's sort of on all of these layers, this sort of this maturity coming online for all of these layers, all of these domains, applying a subtler sensitivity and a discernment around choice making, and to almost stop trying to hang our hat on singular abstractions or kind of even talking about resolving problems in the world at these coarse grained levels. And we know we need that to kind of filter down, but it's sort of just this, it feels like something we're becoming like meta conscious of, is just how much nuance is going to be required to actually do the thing we're doing. And at the same time, it is very simple. So this kind of tension between the complexity and the nuance and just the simplicity of these kind of universal statements like save the planet, love everybody. Yeah, and also kind of this appreciation for the ways in which all of these different aspects can either be self-supporting or self-degrading. So you have the individual who's now developed a slightly better choice-making capacity, and because of that, they're able to participate in a project to develop a slightly better system. And it's sort of all these little breadcrumbs around the place across these different scales, as they are being imbued with maybe we could call it care, like just little pieces of care being inserted in all these different places, feels like probably a more accurate representation than we can conceptualize otherwise. Which can be tricky, because then when we have conversations that are more sort of coarse grain and in the macro, it's sort of, there's this other skill of like, how do we have a macro coarse grain conversation and then massage that into the nuance? And it's sort of like because when we play in the macro, there's kind of an allure there because we're passing around these big blocks and it's all very manageable. And maybe there's sometimes a temptation to hang out there longer than we should. And then maybe vice versa, like when we get into the nuance of the everyday, there's kind of a simplicity there of like, oh, I only have to deal with what's immediately in front of me. And so it's sort of like there's always these temptations to find a home in a certain realm or at a certain scale. And maybe one of the difficulties of our condition is the necessity to constantly traverse, constantly leaving the place that we have found comfort in to turn over the next stone, but not doing that too quickly as well. And to be animated in doing that, but not to mania, but not to be depressed to the point of nihilism.
Oh, absolutely. Well, it does. I like this point that it's very simple and yet very nuanced. And it does make me think, like, traditionally, there'd be this notion in theology that God is simple, which of course sounds ridiculous. But it's like God is simple because it's not composite parts. Like there's no like parts. God is like one in all. In any part of God, the whole of God is contained, right? He's like simple. So there's this very interesting thing where the goals of the human being are simple. Don't create drama. Save the planet. Enhance your community. Like a child could hear those things and know what it means. It's the doing. It's the realizing, the implications of it. But I will say this. I think it is very important to actually make the goals simple because the likelihood of consensus on non-simple goals is very low. So like philosophers and different people can make very complicated goals. You're done. That's not going to work. Like you can't have a super complicated goal. You have to have goals that are simple. You have to make the doing of the goals difficult because then you can't get lost in abstraction because it's all about the doing. like often it is the main premises that people make complex to avoid the doing, to avoid the difficulty of the choice. But if you make the initial premise simple, like love God, know God, then the Christian's like, oh, I guess I got to go love my neighbor, as opposed to getting lost in 5,000 pages of theology, right? Well, guy, it's okay to go get lost in 5,000 pages of theology if that is for the sake of loving your neighbor, which you make sure you go and do. So the simplicity can make room for study, but ultimately you can't say you don't know what you're supposed to do, so you have to go act, right? The simplicity removes plausible deniability. So there's a real value in the simplicity. But then, of course, we're also kidding ourselves if we think it's self-evident what it means to love your neighbor. Like, what does it mean to love your neighbor? You say, oh, I give them flowers. Well, guess what? They are allergic to flowers. So you give them flowers and now they think they hate you because didn't you know that they are allergic to flowers, right? Like loving your neighbor, like Bertrand Shaw once said, the problem with loving your neighbor is that they don't always like it. That's exactly right. Like, what does it mean to love your neighbor, right? Self-evident. But the simplicity of the premise contains all the possible interpretations. That's the key. Like we said earlier, if you have infinite interpretations, you go nuts. But if you can contain the interpretation, that's when you can get some real productivity, right? So a simple metric can contain interpretation. So now we can actually begin to discuss it. And also the simplicity of the premise, like save the planet, that's going to move your emphasis onto the decision-making, the meta etiquette that we are describing. Because what do you do with the person who thinks driving a car that's not electric for 5 years is not immoral? Like, do you set a hard bounds where you kick them out? Or do you figure out a way to kind of work with them to help them see yourself, like a meta etiquette, like a martial arts, like a skillful way? You can say it's manipulation, but it's not really manipulation. You're trying to hold the community together. You can call it flow. You can call it control. I mean, we tend to call manipulation whenever anyone tries to convince us something we disagree with, but then we call it control when someone's holding a room together in a way that we like, right? We have to move beyond these categories and think in terms of the situation. How to maintain the community, how to get the person to understand things. Like, you can call a teacher manipulative whenever the teacher tells the class to be quiet. But again, the subtlety of nuance, the quality of decision-making. But it gets really intense because someone could jump in at any point and say, that's manipulation. and then throw the whole thing off, right? Like everyone has to mutually reinforce one another in their understanding of the difference between these qualities of actions and quality of decisions in different things. Now, I should also note that basically there has been no scaling meta judgment, meta quality of judgment, meta etiquette in the history of the world. That's why you have game A. That's why you have a system that works regardless what people think about it. Like a system can work. Capitalism works even if you hate capitalism, right? That's the virtue of a system. A community only works if there's consensus, or there was another, like a tribe or something. There has to be, everything can be negotiated. Therefore, it's much more agile. Therefore, it's much more human. But negotiation as the organizing principle of the group is always small scale. As you go larger of the scale and include more difference, the more you find negotiation becomes cumbersome and you're tempted by the system that works regardless what people think. That's the virtue and it's the vice. If we're talking now about a game, if for game B to be actually scalable, you would require the ability to negotiate at scale, not simply within a tribe. Well, that's quality of judgment, that's meta etiquette, that's all of these crazy abilities. So if we don't have a mass training ground for that, it probably will not occur. So that's going to be very difficult. And I think the other thing too, you would have to convince people of is to make their metric for what life is about away from comfort to something else. Because if it's comfort, you're going to simply avoid the game. You're going to avoid judgment. You're going to avoid meta etiquette, and you're simply going to put yourself in a situation that's comfortable. But then, of course, the comfort is what, say, destroys the planet or different things like that. So, I mean, a lot of people are talking about meaning as, we need to have this sort of meaning. Oh, and the other thing I would say is the moment the emphasis is on decision, action, relation, that's going to help you avoid the temptations of hiding in scale. And also decisions tend to have to work on all levels of the scale. So that's going to have to make you, if it's a quality decision, so now you can't hide. You have to kind of think on all the different levels. So that's another reason why the emphasis of decision, judgment, or you could even say the Blondel action is a very big deal, because it's always having to commune with all the levels of the stack. You can't hide in levels of the stack. But no, I think it also, what it seems to require is the ability of people to handle difference, to not be thrown off by difference, to kind of talk with different. And that's the opposite of comfort. So then the question becomes, what is the opposite of comfort? And I suppose you could say the willingness to face difficulty or adversaries or different things, which one you probably need a mythological structure to even think to do or to see yourself in, where you have the mythos of the need to face adversary. And it does seem to associate a bit with meaning, because meaning, if you have meaning in life, then if you face adversaries or you have a failure, you're able to take a failure. The virtue of meaning is actually re-meaning. The ability to take a failure and re-mean it into an episode on your getting better, right? If you don't have meaning and you lose everything, it can't be part of a story. It can't be thematic. Like we were saying earlier, it just has to be a failure. Meaning is where you go, oh, yes, I'm able to kind of flip the script, transvaluation of values in the Nietzsche sense, and I can take a failure and re-mean it as an opportunity to grow and to overcome, right? So if there is a kind of meaning principle in operation, then when people, or story principle, then when people encounter one another and there's disagreement or difficulty, people can make re-mean that disagreement or that conflict into something that points to a bigger story, as opposed to the meaning, because there's always going to be meaning, and the meaning will be this person sucks, or this person can't agree with you. The meaning will be something negative. But if you can make it re-mean, then you can transform it to evidence of the ability of people to work together, or the ability to make a decision together. The difficulty can be re-meaned into a challenge along the way of a story, where the theme is, in fact, say, the ability to work at scale decision-making that isn't game A, right? So there's something about also having, we do have to then change, well, this, I guess what I'm saying, for the game B stuff to kind of work on scale and different meanings of scale, you do have to basically ask, what is the meaning of life? What is the prime metric? And what is the story of the human being? So you do have to, it's kind of funny, because when you ask that, it's like really large scale, but it works on all levels of the scale. Because whatever the meaning is of the human being redefines the entire scale, right? And if we say the meaning of the human being is to say maybe rise to the occasion, to learn meta skills, to have meaning, to bring forth the mythic structures, like suddenly then that re-means what the difficulties are or the predicaments are. It changes what they are in a manner that is then feeding the theme of a story. So for me, like, I guess I'm also getting at in the same way that I would want to talk about sometimes a little bit more emphasize exhaustion than nihilism. I do wonder sometimes if you actually need to emphasize re-meaning versus meaning. Because like re-meaning seems to be more of what the problem is, because everyone has meaning. Like maybe nihilism is a kind of meaning. Nothing means anything, right? Like you wouldn't be doing anything if it didn't mean anything. We like everything means. Actually, meaning can be the problem because we're exhausted by all the possible meanings. We can't contain the possible meanings to a different judgment. It's the ability to kind of control what happens and to make it re-mean. Like we need the ability to kind of flip the script, as Cadell Ass will say, or to transvalue. So I wonder if a framing sometimes can be the ability, like re-meaning as opposed to meaning. And I'm not saying that Vervaeke wouldn't agree with any of that, but there's something about the phrase re-meaning that I think then puts it in the realm of skill, action, doing something. It's not just like a worldview, it's your ability to improv, like in a cyphertext, to make something that happens to you re-mean and turn it around. And that's then when meaning seems to be more like a skill to me. Like it's more like, oh, you're able to take something and then make it part of your story, make it part whatever it happens. But if your meaning is that the universe is conscious and something like that, well, that doesn't mean you can't necessarily mean whatever happens to you re-mean. Maybe you say, oh, well, the difficulty is part of a universal consciousness. Well, that's not going to be really deep to you. It's going to be too vague, like to really kind of transform you. Maybe not, maybe so, but there has to be this kind of re-meaning ability. And actually, and then I'll give it back to you, that's kind of the key to a lot of the religious worldviews. Like, if you believe in Jesus, it's not that like, oh, the universe has meaning because, God exists. It's like Jesus is able to take the lowly and make them first. He's able to take humility. He's able to make humility a virtue. There's like a re-meaning that occurs, which for Nietzsche was the great problem, the transvaluation. But actually that transvaluation is critical because you're able to take things that are rough in life and then make them a virtue. You can't have certainty, can't know anything for sure. Well, guess what? Faith is a virtue. Like, oh, you're humble, you're least. You like, oh, well, guess what? There's a virtue in that. Like, there's a re-meaning that occurs that then flips the script. That's where you're putting meaning in the realm of relation, situation, circumstance, and choice. So I think talking about re-meaning can be helpful.
Nice. So in one sense, all we're ever really doing is making the choice that's in front of us, and we're either making that to varying degrees of effectiveness. This is the Landry thing, but there's also a way in which we're intricately linked and connected to the whole, where all of these different scales are feeding into that choice, and a lot of it in a sense is only indirectly in our control. We definitely, there is a collapsing of the choice, which is, at least it appears that we are making that, but there's something about in any given moment where part of this web that is determining and constraining certain aspects of the choices that we're making. And one of the really important aspects is the meaning layer, which is individual, but it's also collective.
Yep.
And it's collective across different scales as well. Sort of goes all the way up into the metaphysics of our species in any given paradigm. But then there's also kind of layers of the meaning that your family tradition has and the kind of meaning that your friends make. And this ties in with our point around anticipation and the processing of information through mythic structures. You are limited in the meaning you can make based on the different schemas, whether they be mythic or more rational. And so I think what I'm trying to illustrate here is that in one sense, we are this endpoint that is collapsing potential in any given moment through our choice, but we're also kind of breathing through all of reality in each moment as we're doing that. And what I find powerful about this frame is in how it kind of holds the tension of absolute responsibility and a kind of liberation through realizing that all of reality is holding itself in a sense, and there's kind of this tension between that. um yeah, and so when we're meaning making, we have these constraints upon us, and we can't just pull things out of thin air. There has to be a basis for that, and some of that is going to be in our sense making. Like what can we actually perceive through our senses? What experiences have we had? What can we know through story? What can we know through abstractions of science and math? And so, yeah, there's like, I think I'm just trying to really illustrate this, the way in which the whole world is collapsing in and through us into a single point of choice that then is feeding back out into the network of choices that are being made. And I think this, yeah, when it comes to the quality of our discernments, there's something about being able to focus into a single moment with that feels really important, because it's very tempting when you start trying to morally justify things to go out really far and kind of try to look at things way beyond the scope of the immediate experience. And I've found personally in my own life that this frame of just sort of making the next best choice, which I think David Snowden also has something around that, so credit to him if it's his. But yeah, really, it's a trite phrase, but I think it's really empowering. So to know that you are just making this next choice, but at the same time to also know the way in which that choice is bound up in this complex layered web.
I think that's exactly right. I think when Hegel talks about the absolute, or some people have called it absolute idealism, that's what he's trying to describe. Unfortunately, the absolute was understood as some final enlightened place where you're transcendent of all knowing and all that nonsense, when really Hegel was suggesting is that the subject that comes to achieve absolute knowing comes to realize there is no absolute, independent of the situation of the subject making choices relative to the world in which the subject is situated in. So there's a way, absolute knowing is a realization of the limit of the subject to know an absolute independent of the subject, but that's because the subject becomes part of the absolute, and what I've also called the absolute situation. It's not that there isn't an absolute, is that the absolute is always working in through the choices of the subject. And I also talk about the absolute choice, which is to identify with otherness, with the world, to choose to believe the world is real, to choose to believe the world is valuable, which then changes the quality of the absolute, which then works back and changes you back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So the absolute in Hegel is this movement of a choice into the world that changes the situation of the world, that changes you making choices, and it goes back and forth and back and forth and back. It's a moving, alive situation. I think thinking of, so there are no things, only situations. The reason we can't get to things in of themselves is because there are no things. We can certainly, though, get to a world in itself. I can't get to the bookcase in itself, but I can get into the world that the bookcase is situated in. And because I am part of the world that the bookcase is in, even though I don't access the bookcase directly, what is the bookcase is already in me and being part of the situation, and so I can indirectly receive real knowledge about the bookcase. That's the move that's really important. In the same way, like Matthew was mentioning this, is that in Karl Barth makes the point that you can't get access of God directly because he's God and totally transcendent, but God gives you through his grace knowledge of him, so then you're able to get real knowledge about God because of through grace he gives you that ability. Well, a way to think about what Hegel is saying is that the absolute, the situation of reality, gives you access to things in of itself by making you part of the situation. And so even though you can't directly get at things in of themselves, you can get at things and their real knowledge because you're part of the world. And ultimately there are no things, just situations of which manifest as things, but only to the degree that they are located in a network of relations. So, you know, so there are no things, there's just worlds, and we're part of the world, and we are making the world in that absolute situation relative to the quality of our choices. And that certainly is Mr. Landry. And if you think about that, then basically, this is the problem. Like, we take this Kantian move, we've been spending all of our time going, how can I think to get to the thing, to get thought to correspond with the bookcase, to know the world that's actually there, when really thinking is in the business of knowing how to make decisions to best participate in the world that you are part of the bookcase with. Thinking is about learning how to make better decisions, because that is what is making the world that you are in that is working back on you. And if you have a world of people that think the name of the game of thinking is, say, research or data collection, so we can know like what's actually there, then we're not in the business of decision making. In fact, we're in the business of escaping decision. You as the subject shouldn't be making decisions. You should just be learning the facts. You should just be gaining correspondence with reality. So what we've done is we've said an educated person is someone who learns facts, who has collected facts, not someone who can make quality decisions. An educated person is someone who can make quality decisions. Well, we haven't focused on that because we focused on education being a matter of gaining info and data, which of course you'll never be able to do as good as the system or the authority or the AI or the internet. And so we've literally set people up to associate education with that they will never be very educated at. And to the degree they are educated, they will be eclipsed by AI or captured by the system. But if instead we say, no, education is about the ability to make good decisions, to participate in the absolute well, AI can't do that. And the system can't really capture that so well unless you outsource your decision-making to the system. So now we start seeing ways to work the human out of control, because the focus is on the ability to make quality decision, which you need to study the humanities, you need facts, and you need data to do, but not as ends of itself, but to understand the world that you are in and participating in, so you can be a better source of decisions that create that world, that work back to create you, and therefore constitute better the whole absolute situation that you are part of. But again, we have not associated education as the business of making quality decisions. And perhaps one of the reasons we haven't is because that would require absolute responsibility. And the moment, if I can define education as being good at trivia, like Neil Postman talks about, whatever questions you ask me, I know the facts, I know the answer, so I'm an educated person. Well, if I define that, then I have literally defined being educated that of which never forces me to face existential discomfort. Because in fact, I'm always puffed up. I know all the facts. I know all the data. Let me pull out my phone. I can look it up. I never have to face discomfort. So we have defined education as the exact opposite of what would constitute education, the ability to discern. Classically, education was about the ability to discern. What is wisdom? Wisdom is applied knowledge in a general framework. Okay. Discernment, judgment, the ability to discern. Well, we've defined education as the exact opposite. In the same way that we took etiquette, which in my opinion was in the business of avoiding the eggshell phenomenon, and defined it as what creates the eggshell phenomenon. We have taken all of these things and defined them by their exact opposite, because we haven't had control of the situation of the world to make sure they're not defined as their exact opposite. And of course, the system would want them to be defined as their exact opposite, because then it doesn't have to worry about anything. And in fact, the system can go, oh, you want to do a game B? You're not capable of it. Yeah, the system's like, I'm game A, you want to do a game B. To do a game B, you require quality of decision and all those things we said, and you can't do it. So you can't move to some sort of alternative. Now, you can say the system actually trained people to be incapable of the alternative. Well, that's a good game of chess. you know, what are we going to do now? Like, are you going to like get better at your game of chess? Are you going to get better at your quality decision? But it definitely seems, thinking about choice, like choice is never, like we think about choice as purely individual. Like you individually chose to do X, Y, and Z. But if we think about choice as going into a network that then works back into everyone else making choices, then individual choice is all, every choice is network choice almost. Like there's a, you know, we talk about individual choice, but what if we thought about network choice or world choice, right? Like what if we were to think about world choice, that you are the node necessary for choice, but choice is always world choice, not individual choice. Well, if you talk about world choice, you're definitely aligning with an absolute situation. And frankly, you're also aligning with reality, because reality doesn't consist of things. It consists of networks, relations, and situations. Like there are no things in reality, because like Owen Barfield talks about that as idolatry. Once you believe that things exist independent of relation, you've created idols that then are going to lead to all sorts of pathologies and problems in his book on Saving the Appearances. So like there's only a world. We only ever access a world, and we know, and we gain real knowledge about the world. So that would then mean that our real choice is a world choice, not an individual choice. And the more we think about choice as always world choice, we're probably going to get better at it. We're probably going to have higher quality choice. And so I, you know, thinking about world choice might be helpful.
Nice. Yeah, there was an image coming to mind around the way that making choices as a group begins to construct a field of influence, and maybe there's sort of a question there around what is the relationship between a group making choices in a state of coherence and the outside world, or sort of more fragmented things that sort of field encounters, and what is the difference between a field like that sort of subsuming the agency of the things that it encounters versus actually making them a part of this coherent choice making field? Because when we go to the like making world choices, what you're trying to enable there is to have a universal, but to have the freedom to express your subjectivity in the context of that universal in a way that still aligns us to the same end goal, whilst enabling as much of a self to be expressed.
Right.
And we know that there is a what we ultimately desire does actually require a certain level of expression from the subject. We some people think that they want the suppression of the subjectivities that they don't like in order to have their world ideal, but we sort of get to a place where we come to realize that the world ideal is contingent upon the subjectivities that we don't like being present.
Right.
And so maybe there's a question here around like, because if I can make choices that are supportive of the world, and there's going to be degrees of freedom in that, right? Like I might make a high quality choice, but maybe there's degrees of freedom in different choices I could make that would be of the same quality. So there's always a kind of creativity in there. We don't want it to be a fatalism. But the moment that I make a choice that I seem to be of high quality as a world choice that seems to compromise someone else's subjectivity, there's like a question in there, like what, and I think re-meaning is very important in this. It seems like, I guess this is the age-old problem of like how do I know that what I'm telling, what I'm sort of, what value I'm bringing into the world through my choice is equal to or better than the value that someone else is trying to bring into the world through their choice. And maybe the truth, thanks for bearing with me, is that in the universal, there is always the ability to express subjectivities in their truest sense through the process of re-meaning in a way that supports the universal goal or the planetary choice. And our real quest, particularly if you like philosophy, is the re-meaning to clarify and reveal the truth of people's subjectivities in a way that supports the world choice. And maybe that does require the sublimation of certain drives and the transformation, a kind of alchemical transformation of the more sort of dark aspects of the psyche to be put in service. And maybe in that I'm committing the fallacy of assuming that the mythic can be the real. But yeah, what are your thoughts?
So I think you put your finger on basically the biggest issue in the organization of new societies and different things. So the question being, is there not an issue where when the individual chooses X, Y, or Z, how do you know that that choice aligns with the other? How do you know it's a world choice versus you just telling yourself it's a world choice when it's really an individual choice, which then would lead to all the pathologies and different things? So that basically is what you must be able to answer if you're going to replace game A. If you cannot replace that, if you cannot answer that, you cannot replace game A, because capitalism has been the only thing that has approximated an answer to that problem. With self-interest, a testing mechanism, I create a product that I want you, how can I know that you want it? Because you buy it, right? Like to a reasonable degree. Like capitalism as a epistemological sorting mechanism to help give us a reasonable explanation or address of that problem is the only thing we've ever come close to being able to deal with that issue at scale. Now, you don't need capitalism in a small town. You can just do a barter system. But when we're talking at scale, great pluralism, great difference, capitalism is the only thing that's ever done it. Now, here's the issue. Capitalism seems to have environmental issues, different pathologies, giant corporations, and so on and so forth. So the question is the following. Are we with game B? And there are people who, of course, say game AB, BA, there's different ways. Like when we talk about game B, are we talking about a reformation or a revolution? If you were talking about a revolution, that would require an entirely new system of organizing resources, data, and so on and so forth. China is arguably doing that with their AI, and I'm not sure if we want to live in an episode of Black Mirror. Like, we're certainly seeing that there are ways to do command economies. That would be an alternative to game A, a command economy. Maybe you want that. I'm not sure if China's the way. I'll let other people decide. That would be the dream of how to have a central planner would be AI. That is an alternative to game A. Would it be better than game A? I don't know. But you could certainly, through a control economy, make sure that everyone's individual choices align with the world choice. Of course, do the people in government decide the world choice? That could be totalitarian. Okay, so to have a revolution as game B, it would require an emergent organization of individual choices that have the best likelihood to think they align with the world interest, if you will, and it not be game A, capitalism. That seems like a very, very, very tall order. So it would probably be the case that when we talk about game B, if we mean it in some meaningful sense, as opposed to an idealistic sense, we're probably talking about a reformation, where you are morally sublating capitalism, negating sublating in a Hegelian sense, capitalism into something different. And you could call this game AB. It would seem like for game B to actually survive, it's not going to replace game A, but have game A in it. according to a different quality of the same mechanisms. Well, right here, we're talking about the ability to judge quality. How do you judge differences of quality, right? Well, you would need the training to do that. So as we know, capitalism tends to operate because of the intersection of self-interest and self-regulation. That's the key here. So for example, I want to make money, but to make money, I have to convince you to give me money. So I have to self-regulate myself to not piss you off. So self-interest intersects with self-regulation. That's kind of the whole virtue of it. Now, the problem is when you get entities that are too big to fail, then there's a separation between self-interest and self-regulation, because I don't have to self-regulate because there's no threat of me getting destroyed or defeated, and there's nothing you can do. That's what's happened today in corporatism. Self-interest and self-regulation have been separated. So the question is the following: how do you keep self-interest and self-regulation together? How do you make sure they always go together? Well, there's two ways. There's some ways. You can regulate. You can have the government come in and regulate it to make sure that they're always together, make sure the banks are always in interest of their companies. The problem is the regulators tend to be captured by the banks or the corporation, regulatory capture, and there tends to be a lot of laws, but not a whole lot of enforcement. There's a lot of enforcement on the small businesses that are trying to change things, but not the corporations that have a lot of money. So regulation doesn't seem to work too well. Okay, well, you could have an economic catastrophe that destroys all the corporations, tears down the big system, and gets you back to square one. Yeah, that could happen. It could cause World War III or a financial apocalypse. So that might not be too good. But, the hour of Nineveh flies at dusk. It could be a really dark dusk, but we'll see. There's another option. Or the third can be to change the quality of the subject, that they, by their own choice, keep self-interest and self-regulation together, because they have a different definition of what constitutes self-interest. So, for example, if I believe that it is in my self-interest to engage in a beautiful world as opposed to a wealthy world, well, you only get beauty if you regulate yourself from doing the things that destroy beauty, and only if you regulate yourself to create the conditions of beauty. So, for example, in order to enjoy William Faulkner, you must learn to enjoy literature. You must meet the condition of being someone who can read William Faulkner, right? Otherwise, the beauty may not come forth. So whenever you get the feeling of throwing Faulkner across the room and being mad at him, you regulate yourself to make sure you meet the condition of being able to enjoy that beauty. So there's a regulation that occurs because you have defined what is in your self-interest beauty. Now, the question is the following: why would you define beauty as in your self-interest? Well, because maybe someone has convinced you that beauty is not merely pretty, but a glimpse into the metaphysical depths of reality that then can create intrinsic motivation. Oh, that's what beauty is? I want that. Well, you're going to have to self-regulate yourself to actually be capable of that. So right now, the main definition of self-interest basically is in terms of profit, pays for bills, stuff like that. So then people self-regulate themselves in terms of that self-interest. Well, they regulate themselves in the sense of, I'll be at work tomorrow, even though I don't want to be there. I will regulate myself from staying up all night and drinking so that I can pay my bills, right? People are making decisions on how they regulate themselves relative to their self-interest. We would have to widen the scope of self-interest. If you widen the scope of self-interest, then you will transform how people self-regulate themselves. So you have to convince people, and therefore have the skill to convince people, that there are other things that are in their interest beyond the immediacy given in materiality that game A currently defines as in your self-interest. So if you define as in your self-interest having, make an obvious example, if it's in your self-interest to have a big house, you will probably always be controlled by game A, because that is a material condition that they have great control over the conditions of how getting the big house, ergo a very expensive price. So you will have to self-regulate your way in a manner that makes you captured by game A. You will not be self-regulating yourself in a way to escape or to reform game A. You will be regulating yourself in a manner that contributes to game A, right? Okay, so let's pick a different metric. What if your metric was instead to say, be able to create a room that feels very alive? Like you walk in, like when you have a gathering with people, it feels like home instead of a hotel. What if that ability to create a home instead of a hotel, to create a dialogos, if you will, versus a kind of small talk boring, what if you decided it was in your self-interest to be able to do that? Okay, and maybe you decide it's in your ability, your self-interest to do that, because if you're not able to do that, you can't have real friendship, you can't have alternative communities, and you can't actually have an experience of the fields or the spirit of humanity that might be the only thing that's left for us after AI. Well, now it's in your self-interest to gain those abilities. You will then self-regulate yourself in a manner to make sure that you gain those abilities, because you have to go through the self-regulation to do that. Oh, this self-regulation is not so easily captured by Game A. You're still paying for products. You're still offering products. You still have Game A mechanisms in place. But by changing the self-interest, you change the self-regulation that keeps you from self-regulating in favor of Game A. So one of the reasons, like one of the great tasks, is actually creating a very compelling case for different self-interests. Because within Game A, and then people will operate within Game A in a manner that is avoiding the capture of Game A. Now, the major problem in this is that, let's say this is happening in liminal web spaces, or someone is creating like beauty that people are convinced they need to engage in, or like the meta etiquette skills that people are convinced they need to engage in, or someone is creating a community to read the humanities to increase the quality of judgment. And then people also are training in quality of judgment. You then need economic support within Game A to say, keep those institutions financed. Well, this is not a replacing Game A, though. This is the introduction of a new pricing mechanism within Game A that allows a pricing of these services so that they can be financially supported. And that would require, like Anthony does so much at Intrinsic Harmony, on a digital pricing of a price mechanism on digital assets, the ability to say invest in communities that can help them grow, that you can get a return on, not simply donate to, because you have to have an ecosystem of investment within these digital communities to actually create the possibility of them sustaining themselves, growing themselves, testing which ones are actually succeeding at, say, generating meta etiquette versus not, changing people's self-regulation. You have to have a new mechanism. So for me, the conversation between Game A and Game B actually is one of Game B being a sublation of Game A into itself, negation sublation, which is primarily defined by a new pricing mechanism for digital assets and different metrics of self-interest. Well, that's where you're talking Game AB, as opposed to how do we avoid competition? How do we stop people from destroying the environment? You're not going to, people, even if everyone agrees that you shouldn't destroy the environment, that's not going to work. It's all about the how. So you have to create a new sense of self-interest that changes how people go about the how. And so once you realize that Game A primarily works through the intersection of self-interest and self-regulation, well, then everything becomes about introduction of a new metric of which defines self-interest. Well, people have not been convinced it's in their self-interest to be responsible. They've not been convinced it's in their self-interest to have quality of decision, because they've actually believed it's in their self-interest to be comfortable, to not have to worry about decision, it's also, they've come to believe that you can't know anything about the world in of itself, so it's not in their self-interest to try to know about the world in of themselves. But if instead you suggest you're part of an absolute situation, that your quality of choices actually impacts the network of choices by which everyone is operating, well, then you making a choice for comfort versus, say, the absolute is quite selfish. Oh, you can't avoid that responsibility, because now you know the framework in which that is thus the case. So we have to be, like, again, like, to really focus on, we've talked about philosophy in the business of decision making. We also have to think about all of these spaces in the business of convincing people in a compelling story. Basically, it will require story and mythos and all these things. We have to convince people of different self-interests, that their scope of self-interest is limited. And in fact, their scope of self-interest is keeping them captured by the Game A, unable to escape it. But let us broaden what is in your self-interest. Guess what's in your self-interest? Friendship. Actual deep community. Well, how do you do that? Well, if we fall into Alan Bloom, it requires mutual truth seeking. Oh, and that will also require meta etiquette. Oh, it's suddenly in your self-interest to gain all of these different things. And oh, without meaning, you can't re-mean everything. And that means you're fragile, not anti-fragile. Well, it's in your self-interest to gain that then. To have the ability to take what's ever thrown at you and to turn the script. So to think in terms of changing the metrics of self-interest will then change what self-regulation looks like into a way that is outside the capture of Game A. And now Game B can be thought of as a negation sublation of Game A, a reformation of Game A, as opposed to a revolution of Game A, which is a much, much taller order. because it is not even clear what the mechanisms of dealing with the problem of individual choice not aligning with world choice would actually be. It's not clear at all what that would look like, other than on a very small scale where you can live negotiate the difference. If I'm in a group of 10 people and I make an individual choice that I think helps the community but doesn't, well, I can get live feedback quite quickly from the small scale. But on a large scale, what does that mechanism look like? Not clear at all, unless we think of game B as some sort of reformation of game A into itself in terms of changing metrics of self-interest, self-regulation, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and it seems like perhaps reformation is a privilege that we have for making change before things become too dire.
Yes.
Sort of like it's past a certain point of intensity, revolution actually becomes the only possibility. And as you said, it's far more radical, and often yeah, there's just a lot at stake. Yeah, so around the new motivations, new regulations, new incentives, and sort of our scope of what we want, desire, and need. So on the one hand, you have the movement that is causing the destruction. The nature of that is necessarily opening up a hole for the desire of its opposite, or the thing that will bring it into balance. And the further along it becomes, the more extreme it becomes, the easier it becomes to speak to that other voice within people. And so you could say a lot of these shifts are occurring at the metaphysical layer, and it is the task of the philosopher to articulate a new reality that speaks to the whole in the person that's been left by the metaphysics of the previous world. The challenge, though, and this comes back to the revenge of the mythic, is on the one hand, we have these, maybe it's Nietzsche's grandchildren, or the absolute knowers, who are sort of trying to develop this ability to not just be unconsciously acting out the dialectic, but then you have most people. And as you were saying earlier in the conversation, it seems like in the landscape we're in, it's actually becoming less and less people who have the competency to not be unconsciously subsumed by the system, because the intensity is increasing, especially with AI. So less and less people are in the place of conscious agency, because the bar for the complexity that needs to be regulated is increasing. And so we run the risk of, as that bar gets higher, we're sort of finding ourselves having more and more of the nodes of choice making in the planetary choice are now doing that unconsciously as a reaction to the lack, rather than as a sort of enlightened choice towards the good. And then we have this other age-old problem that I know you like around intrinsic motivation. And I think earlier in the conversation you talked about, like, you can force someone to learn something, or you can force someone to like go to church, but they're not actually learning, or they're not actually encountering the Holy Spirit. But you can force someone to eat, and you can force someone to like, so in materiality, you can like force things on people. But in the psycho-spiritual, you cannot force, because otherwise you pervert the thing, and it's no longer itself.
Right.
So the intrinsic nature of psycho-spiritual is that it has to be choice, and it has to be choice that integrates the subjectivity of the person making that choice, because that is the limiting factor of whether or not it is their choice. Is it a reflection of who they are? Otherwise, it's someone else's choice. And so we have this challenge around somehow we need to inspire, invoke, intrinsically motivate a population who is increasingly being marginalized by the hyper modern paradigm because the complexity is increasing. They wouldn't be increasingly marginalized if the complexity wasn't increasing, but it is. And so it seems that the dream of, which I know you don't subscribe to, of the enlightened subject where the world is just full of absolute knowers, we know that is not that's the ideal, and it's not possible, and it's, as I'm arguing, seems to be becoming increasingly difficult in this landscape. Although you could argue that the gap that's opening up is a gap that could awaken an absolute knower, but it seems to me more likely that the less agency someone has starting out, the more likely that that gap is actually filled with an unconscious reaction rather than a conscious awakening, because the conscious awakening type requires a kind of agapic love that does need space and time. And it would seem that under immense pressure, the human condition is that most people default. It does awaken the radical few, and it does so more radically than perhaps times where they're not under pressure. But this is my concern. I think the changing of the motivations of the individual will be largely unconscious to the degree that they are under a lot of pressure. And although that might momentarily stabilize us, it seems like because the change in motivations is one of an unconscious reaction, that we will just find ourselves out the other side. And I think the other side of AI domination is perhaps something like pagan human sacrifice. Perhaps I don't know that for sure, but this is sort of the thought. Like, if we are reacting to everything that modernity stands for, and we are increasingly unconscious in that reactivity, could this gap that opens up to shift our motivations not just become one of an equal, if not greater, reactivity on the other side to the thing that we're rebelling against?
Yes. So excellent. So it was a bunch of things. So what you were describing, Bard, Owen Frager, they'll talk about pathos, and basically Gameby does not appreciate pathos, and pathos is always lurking. And just when you think you've escaped it, it's Lacan's the real, the subconscious, these things that burst back onto the scene, that just when you think you've gotten rid of it is exactly when it's worst, because that's mean it's been hiding and it's going to explode back and destroy everything. And the problem of pathos is the biggest problem. Honestly, it is the biggest problem. The unconscious erupting onto the scene, the subconscious, the real. This is the biggest problem. And this is the problem that basically only capitalism has offered any sort of slight way and successful way, frankly, to channel pathos in a direction that increases not only manages it, but increases prosperity for the average person on planet Earth. And capitalism has done that. The problem is it has figured out ways through state involvement in mixed markets to separate self-interest and self-regulation for too big to fail entities, and here we are. But so one of the big things that capitalism does, for example, is offer you a job. One of the main functions of a job is to help you escape the real, because you're not able to go to that birthday party because you got to go to work. It's not just about money. It provides ways to hide and to conceal and to create plausible deniability. Capitalism provides all sorts of ways that human beings can put off dealing with their subconscious when they're not ready. And even if they don't like their job, by going to their job, it can kind of actually what they don't like is themselves, but they can scapegoat their work and blame that, and then they don't have to face themselves until maybe later in life when they've learned how to. Capitalism provides useful avenues for dealing with the reality of pathos. And of course, competition as a whole is a way that humans can gain status and feel good about themselves and deal with their pathos. Like aggression, violence, competition, these are ways that humans have dealt with pathos. And if you're going to get rid of those things, the question is the following. A lot of people in Game B will talk as if pathos is something that humans can evolve out of, that it is possible to lift consciousness to a place where you don't have to worry about pathos anymore. I think that's very dangerous and also probably not true. Now, I can't say for certain it's not true, but in my experience, even the most enlightened human being, when they go for 10 days without food, becomes a monster. Even the most enlightened person who doesn't have access to their internet because the electricity is gone suddenly becomes irritable, disagreeable, and not very nice. Everyone's fairly enlightened in Starbucks. Not many people are enlightened on the Oregon Trail. And so this is the key. The pathos is always lurking. And most of the time we deal with pathos by hiding it or creating comfort or making things easy. But that's not a true address. Capitalism has actually not truly addressed pathos. It's managed pathos, if you grant me that distinction in language. It's the best management system of pathos we've ever had. If we are going to talk about a reformation of Game A into Game B, you're talking about addressing pathos, probably more than managing pathos. Well, that's something there. And if you wanna argue that basically because of the meta crisis, we must address pathos, we can't merely manage pathos, which I take to be the argument of a lot of the Game B and Daniel Sly market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then this is a discussion of something that has never been done in human history at all, except temporarily. Like, because let me explain by that, like, comfort has never lasted. Like, rich people become bored and suicidal. Like Durkheim talks all about how suicide correlates with wealth. Mental illness correlates with wealth. That's an example of an unaddressed pathos that cannot manage itself either. And so it becomes self-destructive. Like unaddressed pathos materializes, it seems, in mental illness, because there's something about pathos that in a positive sense is thymos, as the tripartite school will talk about. And if you don't address thymos, which I know Mr. Limburg has discussed, Raymond K. Hessel, you do see this. If you don't address thymos, humans feel worthless. They don't feel like they have value. And when humans don't feel like they have value, there's two responses. Curling up in a board, becoming like hopeless, depressed, and mentally ill, or extreme violence, exploding against that, and that's the paganism coming back, right? So the conditions that tend to make the depression, meaning crisis, mental health crisis, whatever you say, are the same conditions that tend to make a return to paganism. And isn't there a way that we see in the insurrection in January with Trump a kind of return to paganism? Is not all of the kind of return to these kind of popularist movements have a certain sort of like, just get rid of the liberals, just stop the bad guy? There's this certain, like, even wokeism has a certain paganism to it, and it's kind of mob mentality, right? It's not, and I would say there is something about the mythic structure that's coming through both, like the revolutionary mythic and the insurrection and the wokeism. There's a stopping of the scapegoat. You see mythic kind of fragmented. It's not systemized into a story, but that's what happens when you're not, when you don't address these things and your management system is gone. It never manifests in a one-to-one comparison with previous paganism, but it manifests kind of ventilating, comes out in different things. So if we're going to talk about addressing pathos versus managing pathos, or you can just say the whole worries about global warming and the meta crisis is wrong. You can take that view. You said there's nothing to worry about. Everyone needs to calm down. AI is not a big deal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is an avenue. You can take that point of view. That might be fine. But I can also see where the very thing, like, I see where the things that may address pathos would actually be good for individuals, even if the system doesn't need to be addressed. Like, even if capitalism doesn't eat itself, the very things that might address pathos would actually improve the quality of life of an individual, even if we are overreacting about Game A, right? So that would be my counter to that, but that would be a counter to everything I'm saying. It's like, you don't need to worry about all this. You're worrying about the future too much. Calm down. It's like, okay, maybe I am. I do not know. but actually the ability to address pathos, or to make it more explicit how one does it, may actually indeed be something that benefits the quality of life of an individual and anyone who so cares to do it. So the enterprise may not be wasteful even under those conditions. So it would seem that what addresses pathos is beauty. Beauty seems to be the thing that suspends pathos and makes it acknowledge that there's something transcendent of it that's higher than itself. So it can never, by its very path, its pathos must always humble itself before that very thing and be in service of it. So you want to be violent? Well, you have to be violent in a manner that speaks to the Christian God. Oh, you want to actually kind of have dominance? Well, you have to have dominance that's kingdom building, for say what Christ is doing, right? There's a kind of transformation of the nature of that pathos to serve. You have to somehow convince people to have pathos be servitude. And now I'm speaking from a Christian tradition because that's the one I know best. But there is a certain, like, how do you make pathos serve people? That's what capitalism has done, right? It's figured out how to take self-interest, self-regulate, put them together, take people's pathotic drives and make them like increase the quality of life for the average person on planet Earth, right? That's basically what you have to do. You have to convince people to turn their pathos in a way that serves people. And I think and that would be addressing it, not merely managing it, right? And you could say that like capitalism has been a kind of a simulation of that address in being a management that can convince people to do it. But it has not been direct, so it's not been owned, so it's not been there. And we can see it has not been there and directly teach, precisely because people aren't, when they're comfortable, they're depressed, meaning crisis. That's all evidence that we've not addressed pathos, we've managed it. Well, going back to Alan Bloom, Closing of the American Mind, you could even get into Roger Scruton, all these people talking about tradition. The point of the university was to equip people with the ability to address pathos, not merely get a job that could manage pathos. That's what culture is supposed to be, but we don't know what culture is. We think culture is highfalutin, rich people. The role of culture is to provide a way to address pathos when the economic system managing it fails or actually succeeds to the point where people are so generally wealthy that they can be bored. The moment boredom becomes a possibility, you desperately need culture to provide people with the resources to address their pathos, as opposed to end up then blowing up, right? Now, that may look like, say, joining jiu-jitsu. That may look like being able to appreciate the arts. Mainly the key is actually having an experience of seeing some kind of cultivation of the sense of beauty. Because beauty is what then forces you to order your pathos in light of that beauty. And this is basically why I say the fate of beauty is the fate of us. Because if we cannot figure out how to systematically and intentionally organize our relationship with beauty, then pathos wins. Pathos is going to take over, or, you know, it takes us over. So our fate is very much tied to our relation to beauty, because if all we can do is manage pathos, well, then our life is probably quite, well, we always have to be hiding from ourselves, basically. We always have to put ourselves in a situation where we're managing our pathos. If indeed we want to be the kind of subjects that do not have to do that and yet are at terms with our pathos, it seems to have a lot to do with our relation to beauty and our ability to cultivate and to have the skills to create beauty. And I would argue that meta etiquette is how to create beauty in a room. The ability to make quality decisions is the ability to maintain beauty in one's life, that there is a way to create that harmony of experience that all goes together. And I would say that beauty, like friendship exists where there's a feeling of beauty. That you do not have friendship where there is not a feeling of beauty. Now we have to get into good, trueness, and beauty, like true good and beauty and how those go together. You get into very practical things like architecture, like the design of building, like the way that one does music, the way that one has a social gathering where you're not just focusing on you. When you talk with your friends, you don't merely ask about their job, you ask about their ideas and worldview. And that requires you to be able to handle the worldview so you can make them feel like you care about them, because you talked about care, where care seems to be a lot of it. Beauty is what says you must care. Beauty is what says you must care. I don't care how hard your pathos is. I don't care whatever. If you do not care, you have failed. There are real stakes. You must address your pathos. That is, you must change your life, like the Wilka poem goes. So beauty is always a strike, and it's a strike against your pathos that then gives you a mission for your pathos, thus changing it into thymos. And that's when you then see the gymnasium, the Colosseum. Actually, they would describe the athlete as beautiful. There's an athletics that is beautiful, right? There's an oration that's beautiful, right? There's a way of friendship that's beautiful, right? There's a way of seeing the world that's beautiful, right? Beauty changes the horizon of what you experience into a world that is different in quality than one that is merely utility. And then you start making decisions relative to that beauty that then changes the network of the decisions that works back on you. And the fate of beauty is then integrated into all of your absolute choices, of which then is an addressing of the pathos rather than the managing of the pathos. If you do not do this, then paganism, you'll see lots of people putting on costumes, doing rituals, doing performances. Because what is all of this? It is people screaming, we want the beautiful. We don't know how, but it has something to do with outfits, ritual, and paganism is where you're screaming and looking for beauty, but you can't find it because you don't have the quality of judgment to locate it and to commit to it. You don't have a sense of quality, only a sense of the loss of that quality, which is precisely when the pathos of the subconscious roars back because it's not addressed and it wants revenge for not being addressed. So you have to have that experience of culture if you're going to address the subconscious, but we're not talking about that at all. We're either ignoring pathos, pretending like we can freaking evolve out of it by some personal process without creating culture or reading literature or the humanities or giving people a sense of how to exactly be a human being by making quality of judgment. And then we're shocked when the subconscious comes roaring back onto the scene. So we have to take seriously that the fate of beauty is the fate of us. If we do not take that seriously, then the fate of us will indeed be quite a fate. So I think this problem of pathos in the subconscious is extremely serious.
Very good. Very good. Yeah. So the pathos is it's the vitality. And in its absence, we either shut down or we sort of the vitality overcomes us. It's not being regulated by, as you say, something that we're reaching towards and inspired by. And so, and you can kind of see, like, yeah, with a job, you're being given something to channel energy into, but most of the time, for a lot of people, there's no beauty at the end of that. And maybe the closest thing they get is a good, which is putting the food on the table at the end of the day, but it's not something that's truly striking them to the core of their being. It's a means to an end, and therefore they have a functional relationship to it. And over time, function is what begins to dampen the vitality. It's sort of, there is a repetition and an effort, but it's not illuminating anything. There's not a sort of, it's not doing that move of like feeding back into you in a way that kind of animates you for the next step. So you're very much, there's very much like a forceful, you almost, and maybe you could say in some sense, everything you do is in service to a beauty, but sometimes that beauty is very removed from the experience, and therefore you're kind of, I'm thinking of like the father, and maybe this is more of a good, but in a sense, like the father is seeing the beauty of the family, and although the family isn't present at work, they're going back to that image constantly, and just when they're about to sort of fall over on their desk, that image sort of comes back and calls them forth. But there's something about a sort of dissonant experience of that versus a harmonious one where the work you are doing is directly corresponding to the beauty that you're aspiring towards. And it sort of feels like that is a shortcoming of what we have currently set up systemically. Is everyone is aspiring, but very often the aspiration is very cut off from the thing that they're pouring their energy into, which does seem strange in a sense. Like you could fantasize about a world where people's capacities and interests were known in a way where they could be put to work on things that were connected to a beauty that they related to. And maybe part of this is sort of awakening from our slumber of a species that is pushing for survival versus a species that has what it needs and is now aspiring for a certain thriving or flourishing. And we are not as bound by the constraints that forced us to engage in and conform to certain acts that would sustain us. And now we can start looking more to the horizon of what it is that we actually, what it is that is beautiful and what it is that we would like to bring about rather than what we have to bring about. Yeah, and this sort of takes me to a thought around AI where, and I had a question earlier, so I'll feed this in here as well. It's the question of, to what degree will AI be supportive of our choice making, of our world choice making? And this connects to this temptation that I think we're going to have to model everything so that we can allow it to perfectly serve the good, true, and beautiful. Sort of like this, it's like we want so desperately to be in relationship to the transcendentals that we would be willing to try to engineer that, and we miss the step of involving ourselves in the process of doing that. Yeah, so I can imagine a scenario where we say, okay, well, we want everyone to have this thymos and this relationship to reality, and so we're going to categorize everyone's personalities. We're going to collect all of this data so we can know that this is this person and this is what they want, and then we can put them in that situation. And what's scary to me is not, like, I do believe we'll be able to do that very well. Like, I think it would be naive to assume that we won't be able to have that level of a model of what people are and what they're like. But I think as we start to do that, we're going to lose something else, which is much subtler. And I know you've been referring to this as removing the process. I think that's what you've been referring to it as. But I think when I think about AI and pathos, this seems to be my core concern, and it's more of a core concern because I think it's at a subtler layer of this ability to engineer beauty and perfection and have it be so, but to miss out on the sort of fail to weave ourself and our own telos and the telos of mankind into that project.
So on the last point you made, there's $1 million question on, can the human truly experience beauty if they know that's being done to them? So, for example, if I knew, like, there's an argument to be made that if I know everyone on the stage of a great acting performance, Macbeth or something, is a robot, it is very possible that my experience will be very different than if they're humans. But let's say they look identically like humans and everything is exactly the same, but I know they're robots. Then I bet you my quality of experience would be different. Maybe for good, maybe for bad. But let's say I didn't know they were robots. Well, then I may not have a difference of quality of experience, right? And would it be possible to create a scenario where I literally didn't know at all that they were robots versus not? Probably not. That seems really difficult. Like, the funny thing about the Turing test, to truly pass the Turing test, you'd have to not know the thing passed the Turing test. Because the moment you knew it was the Turing test, you would know that it was a robot passing the Turing test, right? So that doesn't quite work. So there's an argument to be made that if the human being knew that the AI was perfectly creating a situation for the beauty, good, and trueness, even if it did, the very knowing that it was so curated would change their experience in a way that made it fake to them, that made it artificial. That's very possible. It would have to do it without them knowing. But then even knowing that you might have this being done to you without you knowing could be causing endless anxiety and pain and make you miserable. So there's an interesting about, can you know that something is perfectly catering to you, and that very knowledge not somehow change the quality negatively of the thing? Maybe it does it positively, maybe it does it negatively, I don't know. But for me, the true threat of what you're describing, it would have to occur without you knowing it was occurring, which is possible. But there's this interesting possibility where knowing that technology exists would then make that situation impossible, because you would always be on the lookout for that situation and therefore avoid the situation. Or then when you're in the situation, you wouldn't trust it. And so the very kind of excess of the problem may be its own undermining, and a kind of Alex Ebert problem. Maybe not, but that's something I don't know. I think it is. Now, it's also the case that you may know the AI is doing, and maybe the intensity of the wonderful experience is so great that you're like, you don't care that it's curated. But what if the thought entered your head where you're going, oh, this thing is catering to what it thinks I am now. Well, I'm going to do something radical and take up jujitsu just to F with it. And so you are doing that, and then the intensity of the rebellion in a very positive way might actually have been increased, because you're like, take that AI, I'm getting away from you. Now it would immediately move in and then start to calculate your new change. Well, then you'll do it again and do it again and do it again. And I do wonder if precisely to escape the feeling of AI capturing us, we might become less prone to comfort, precisely because comfort feels like a lie. And one of the great things that destroys the human soul is comfort and not pushing themselves. Maybe AI will actually help us push ourselves, precisely because we're always trying to escape its way of capturing us and being too simplistic, and we want to force it in a new direction. Now, of course, as soon as we force it again, it will move in that way, but then we do it again and do it again and do it again. So there's a possibility here where actually, to escape the fakeness, we keep moving away and moving away. Now, it could be a situation where humans just, it perfectly cater and it's a soma machine drug, and we just enjoy it and so on and so on. That's also a possibility. But this is actually where pathos could be good, because precisely the pathotic could actually break through and be like, screw this, I'm not going to be so captured, and pathos could actually be our kind of salvation in that sort of sense, right? Because the AI may be able to give us a beauty that does not feel in its process themos. It doesn't feel thematic enough. And therefore, the pathos could be a good thing. It is the case that, like, the benefit of pathos is precisely to save us from comfort, to save us from this level of a beauty, because it would seem to me that there's a difference between the beauty that is merely aesthetic and the beauty of the athlete, the beauty of the great performance, the beauty of the great overcoming. Like, Dante is beautiful aesthetically, but it's also like a great struggle. Dante going through Inferno, working his way up. There's a beauty there, but also a struggle. And I do wonder if deepest beauty requires a feeling of struggle, passion, from Christ, passion. I think it probably does. And that being the case, we might actually, precisely because of our themos, be somewhat saved from the Huxley situation, even though it's that very pathos that is a threat to all of this, right? So, that might be a redeeming understanding of pathos. I'm not sure. The other thing I would say, you mentioned family, and I think also that would get into the process. Like, the process is where the struggle comes out, right? That, like, the difference between the wine made by the winemaker, he struggled to make that wine, versus the wine that's exactly the same taste, color, and so on that came off the conveyor belt. The difference is the process, ergo the struggle. And the struggle, which then is it's beauty that then is integrated with pathos or thymos, that seems to be really what beauty requires, not to just be pretty or not just to be nice. Beauty has some sort of blood in it. And that might be what AI can't give us. AI can't give us blood. Unless if we want to get into a scenario where we wake up as a baby already plugged up into the matrix and don't know any better, that's also possible. Then we'll just hope Neo can save us. I will also note, that I think the point you were getting at with family is really big. like where family is the main source of beauty for people. It's not by chance that the majority of the paganism tends to be coming from incels or people that don't have family or are missing out or who feel sexually repressed. The main way that pathos explodes is when sex isn't addressed. There's sexual urges that are not there, that then people, precisely, they become depressed and isolated to try to kill the sex drive. And then they go into pornography to kill the sex drive. And if they don't do that, or they don't settle with the sex drive, like you could argue, like Japan, which Japan is basically a good glimmer into the future of the West. Like you kind of give up and you become very old. You have a population crisis and different things. To say something that I think is so if we want to say, like, the argument to everything that has been said is that it will never be possible for the majority to address pathos. The majority will, that's always going to be a minority, and addressing pathos is impossible and for the majority of people. And if that's the case, well, then if the game B people are correct, we're in huge trouble. Let's hope that game A is fine and the people who do the address of pathos will be okay and better for it, but it's not going to be like the apocalypse or something. Let's hope. If we go back, the reason why I bring up this point, because if we go back to, say, some Catholic social thought, basically what they said is the only way we've ever addressed pathos is with sex, is with family for the majority of people, and they warn that the birth control would destroy the mechanism of addressing pathos for the majority of people. And if you introduce birth control to the world, then you better really emphasize new ways to address pathos, like through the meta skills or the meta etiquette that we've described, to actually condition people through culture to be able to sense beauty, because that's the main source of beauty in people's lives, a sense of family. And it's also the mixture of good, true, and beauty. But here's the thing. If you give people the choice to have babies, they probably won't, because having babies is really hard, and they're loud, and they take you away, and it's difficult. Like, we've really screwed up by talking about family as this nice, wonderful thing. And actually, you know, you choose to have family, it's wonderful. Family is very hard, and babies are hard, and you have to make sacrifice. And so if you have a choice, you tend to push it off, or you only have one. Like the population crisis right now is not due to people having less children. The people who have children still tend to have 2 or 3 like they always have. The issue is people, it's like no children at all, and there's just an explosion of people not having children at all. Because why would you have children? How do you make that choice? Let's put it this way. How do you make that choice? On what ground do you make that choice? When do you make that choice? Really difficult to say. It's like you always don't know, because it's like fundamentally a non-rational choice. There's no rational basis for making that choice. You either do or don't. And the Catholics were like, people basically have to be forced to have kids. Now, you can say that's oppressive and totalitarian, and arguably it is. But the argument was, if you do not do that, then you must address pathos for the majority, and the majority has never been able to address pathos. So what you then have is a lurking sexuality that is unaddressed in the form of family. So you're not taking sex, channeling it toward family, thus creating a beauty that can address the pathos. That's not happening. So in absence of the lack of family, you have to create a new way to address pathos for the majority, of which has never been done. The reason I think this is important is because arguably a lot of the problems of game A is introduced by the changing family dynamic, not maybe so much because of capital. Like, we have to think, is it capitalism, or is it capitalism plus people choosing to have children or not? Because then you have individuals who are trying to compensate for not having children or not being married, and they're then like saying, extracting the world to prove that they are a true man and that they should be married. You have all these relational dynamics. So the dynamics of sexuality are absolutely massive in this. But the problem is, since we have not thought about birth control as requiring us to need address beauty, then we haven't done it. So instead of turning the birth control into something that could be a wonderful opportunity for people to find new avenues of addressing beauty and opening new doors, we've simply thought about it as an individual choice, not realizing that every individual choice is a world choice, and the world that would introduce would thus require a need to address beauty in a way that has never been done in human history before. And if you do not do that, you will have a pathological response. But this framing, unfortunately, is not allowed, but you always have to frame things correctly so that you can address the problem correctly. But that framing has not been addressed because we're too locked in individual choice, and anything that increases individual choice is inherently good. It's contingently good. Like birth control is contingently good, given that people realize the choice is a world choice. But if you have birth control and people only think in terms of individual choices, then they have no basis to know when to have children versus not. When is a career better than family? When is it a trade-off? People have to make those decisions. They have no idea. And when people don't know, they withdraw, they wait, they put it off. And that's what everyone is doing. They're putting off the choice to have children, which then creates 10 extra years for people to let their pathos explode out, the subconscious explode out, or to end up hopeless and therefore not working on themselves to be a desirable mate, right? Because when you're hopeless and giving up and your pathos is taking over, you're probably not refining yourself in terms of discernment, quality of judgment, and things like that. So one of the issues here is the reason why this isn't, I do think there is a kind of new problem. Because in the past you had, this is kind of funny thing, like in the past you had culture which could address pathos when actually it was less needed because you didn't have, say, birth control so much. So now you need that more than ever, precisely when you don't have it, because because the economic model has also become exploitive. So like now, like you have to extract that as being needed more than ever before, because you need more people to be able to address pathos, because there is more and more changing in the sexual marketplace to create ways of experiencing beauty in the family or community or relationship. Because the thing about a family is precisely its blood, sweat, and tears. That's why the beauty is not merely pretty. We were saying that beauty has to bleed. Well, having a family brings that, and the sacrifice, and it's all bigger than itself, and so on and so forth. So it addressed pathos. If you're going to take that off the table or make it a choice that people probably by definition will push off because it's simply they don't know when to make it. How do you make that choice? There's no foundation for it. Like when you say we're ready to have kids, no one is ready to have kids. Like, what does that mean? You choose to have kids or not. It's like no one earns the spot where they're ready to have kids. It's like trust. You either withdraw or you give it, right? So by changing the sexual marketplace, which was what in the past addressed pathos for the majority of people through a condition of beauty that could be found in the family, that was then brought together. And then religions knew this. Like religions knew this. That's why like religions are all about sex. Like they're all about like true beauty and good and sex and family. Why? Because that's the only thing humanity ever came up with to address pathos for the majority. And then the economic also managed it. So you had a fail-safe system. What the economy didn't do, the family could address. What the family didn't do, the economy could manage. And then in addition to all that, you had a culture that could fill in the cracks and help some people maybe hire, in a sense, absolute knowers, which would be the minorities. But those people could spread the ideas that could change the quality of both of these fail-safes into a better level for one another. Okay, well, the family fail-safe is gone, so you only have the economy. And it turns out when you only have that, then the self-interest no longer takes into account the family and the beauty, and it becomes extractive, or it becomes pathological, missing the beauty of family. And so the need of culture to come in and fill that as an address of beauty is higher than ever before. Unfortunately, culture in the history of the world has never been able to address beauty for the majority of people. But that's what one has to do, given the changing sexual marketplace, which we haven't really thought. We've also kind of thought that sexual options or sexual, like different ways of doing sex could do it. And easily it can, but sex has to be in service of beauty. So sex experimentation as experimentation with enjoyment may not have the blood and tears required to create beauty. It may have a certain enjoyment, which is not bad at all inherently. But if it's a question of can sexual expression address pathos the same way that, say, sex being directed toward family can, maybe for some individuals, but the question would be, can it be for the majority? Well, we don't know. We've never seen the majority try this. But if you try it and it doesn't work, it might be too late and actually hurt further the traditional family model. So this is what we're trying. This is what we are attempting. So that's what's going on.
Yeah. One of the questions that's coming to mind, it's only indirectly related, but is this subtle discernment around a, maybe call it like a nostalgic future versus a technological future, and where are we applying technologies versus where are we kind of, and I know these aren't entirely opposed, but where are we kind of living through pathos? And it seems like there's at the moment just not a lot of nuance around this tension, and it kind of like, as a culture at the moment, we're floating down this river of technological innovation, and every day sort of a new thing gets added in, and we kind of just naturally all take to it. And even if we don't take to it at first, it's sort of like the people around us do, and there's sort of social pressures and whatnot to eventually find yourself immersed in some new form of technology. So yeah, and I think it like why it's so difficult to have this discernment around technology is because of how much leverage it creates. If you're choosing between things that are on an equal plane, it makes sense that there's going to be diversity and maybe even more nuance in the choice making process. But in a sense, you could argue that adopting technology is a no-brainer because it puts you in a different field of agency. However, it doesn't actually, and it actually just puts you in a new field of pathology, typically. But there's kind of this is the illusion that we're succumbing to. But I do like, personally, I want to find ways of using AI. At the moment, I don't. Like I've played around with it, but I, even places where I could use it with my work, I don't. Just because at the moment in my heart it just feels wrong. Like there's just something about, like, I love my work, and therefore the thought of kind of not struggling with it sort of feels like it's in the category of things that I should feel ashamed about, you know?
Sure.
But I do believe that leverage is real and that it does open up new planes of possibility, but the level of agency required to navigate it is of a higher order. And this is this thing we're talking about of the increasing unconsciousness due to the increasing complexity of these things. And it's tricky given the scaling of leverage. However, I think part of the solution, and this is what you were alluding to earlier, is this ability to change the goalpost. So it's only leverage in one sense if your desired outcome is X. But once your desired outcome is time with your family, having your smartphone out at the table, which enables you to completely eliminate the dimension of space in your communications, it actually doesn't help when you're sitting at the table with your family. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Excellent, excellent. If your goal is to make sure that people in the room do not feel like they're walking on eggshells, AI will not help you with that unless you were to ask AI, hey, AI, how do I get, what are some skills that will help me be better at reading people? And AI says X, Y, and Z. Well, you still have to implement them. Likewise, AI might be where you go, hey, AI, how do I do artistic presentations that can't be reduced to AI? And then AI is like, well, maybe you need to do a live poetry writing that you then read there. Or maybe you need to do drum circles, like if you used AI to escape AI, basically, like if you used AI to help you get better at the things that only a human can do, that's where AI will be useful. Because actually a lot of people don't know how to do the things that make humans, like a lot of humans don't know how to do things that only humans can do. So actually AI, in a funny way, if you think about using, you have to go into AI, and I don't really use ChatGPT, but I actually see reasons to be optimistic about it, and I actually see ways, if we think about it as a tool to help us be more human, then you always structure your inputs in favor of, hey, AI, how do I understand Shakespeare in a way that can't be reduced to a ChatGPT prompt? hey, AI, how do I get inspiration from an artistic experience that doesn't make me feel like I should have just watched it on Netflix? Like, if we start thinking about inputs that are literally putting into the input the meta dimension of wanting to be human instead of replaced by the AI, it may give you ideas that you actually have never had before. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's how I can actually have that's how I can enjoy live music, by being part of a drum circle. I never liked live music before, but I never thought of that. Oh, wow, that's how we in our poetry magazine can avoid these problems, by having people write the poetry live and review it there. It can't possibly be off of an AI. Oh, maybe that means I'm more locally involved now. I'm more in the common life because I can't do a live poetry reading and be 100% sure it was live poetry unless it's with people in my local community who I'm around. So there's going to be this interesting way where we could use AI precisely to avoid AI. And the moment you do not make that meta dimension part of your inputs, that could be a problem. But there's a lot to that I think is very interesting. I do recognize, though, that the danger of AI, that it is unlikely the majority of people will do inputs to the AI that are so meta. So there is a real threat there, of course. But there is the possibility, like you say, of what are the ways that I can do inputs not to avoid my work, but actually to make my work more human. And maybe AI can actually help me be more human, because it can help me think of ways to be human that I, as a human in my finitude, am not so good at thinking up. So in that way, you integrate the negation of the AI into the input, thus giving you a sublation of the AI in your relation to it to make you more human. And I think AI is all going to come down to the inputs. Being a master of AI inputs is going to be really, really important. And if you're bad at inputs, it will eat your lunch and reduce you to nothing and take away your humanity. If you're good with your inputs, it may make you very human. But of course, everyone by definition thinks they're good with their input. So everyone is at great risk of overconfidence. And one should not engage with this technology without great fear and trembling. But look, that's how like Jewish tradition was with the Kabbalah. You can't read the Kabbalah till you're 40 years old. There were like religions had this whole like they had these rituals of certain things you couldn't do till certain ages because they were too dangerous. Like that's basically AI is going to bring that back as well. It's like, okay, you want to use this? You're not 40. You sure? You sure? Like that would speak to religious traditions. I think we're going to have to rethink that. Like I think there's going to be considerations of that where we go, AI is really good if you know how to do the inputs, but you don't tend to be good at the inputs till you're 35 or you're much older. So that might be something that we have to think about. And I think so, and a few more things, like also too, it just should be noted, like when we mentioned on the birth control, like again, someone like Mary Eberstadt just kind of notes, we have not, like women's happiness has not necessarily gone up. It has gone down. People feel like their boyfriends force them to have sex with them without commitment because they know they can use the birth control. You also have like the economics of birth control and different things like that, where all of that, if people were aware of those exploitations, could then choose to use the birth control in a manner that helps them still address beauty and not lets them, say, for example, if your boss knows as a woman you can use birth control, then he can like pressure you to use birth control or you'll lose your job, right? He will like fire you or different things. So we see these dynamics arise actually with the technology. But since we've assumed that all technology is good, then we haven't thought through the technology so that we can use it to actually better address pathos. Instead, we throw a technology at it and assume that it will be good, and it turns out just to unlock a different pathic tragedy that we have to figure out in new terms. Now, if you figure out in new terms, in Hegel, every technology that brings a new pathic terrain is an opportunity for a world that's better than the world in the past, but only to the degree that you prove worthy of the pathic terrain. And basically what we see is we've not actually thought through the problem of birth control, really, to use it as a good. We've just kind of assumed it's good, and therefore we have a lot of unintentional consequences. But now we're going to throw AI on top of that. And now we're going to throw probably bioengineering on top of that. And we've also thrown the internet on top of that. So you've really created this nexus of embedded problems that all require addressing pathos. That addressing pathos would require working through each one of those. Maybe AI is basically the only way to kind of think through that. Maybe you go, I'm thinking about, you use birth control and you're like, AI, when should I start a family? What would it mean to start a family that cannot be reduced to AI inputs? Tell me something human. Tell me something that would help me make that decision, because I myself can only make that decision relative to my economic well-being. Well, you can always say that you need a little more money. I have 80,000 in the bank. Well, I need 100,000. Kids are expensive. 120,000, 130. You can always push it off. Is it possible that AI could help us make decisions that there's no obvious rational ground for? Maybe. Maybe AI could say, hey, I'm not really good at, I don't even understand what beauty is. Can you help create conditions for me to experience beauty? Because I don't know how to do it. Maybe. Like, there is something to be said about AI might be the technology required to actually think through and manage what that new pricing mechanism of digital assets would look like, so that you can have a reformation of game A into game B, as opposed to a revolution that would possibly fail. So you might have a situation where we've stacked so many problems on top of one another in a problematic way without thinking about it, that you actually need a super intelligence to figure out how to work through that stack, that without you won't be able to do it. But that would require you to do the right inputs, the inputs of which would negate the AI in the act of the use of the AI. And that is not going to happen if we don't even know there's a difference between artificial intelligence and human intelligence. If that's not going to happen if we spend so much time sitting in front of the computer that we think all the human does is computer outputs, therefore there's really nothing unique to be saved. So there's also, again, a changing of the metric, an awareness of what the metric is and what the human is, or otherwise there's no chance of the AI inputs being a negation, sublation of the AI. And so it's no different. Like, but all of this comes down to addressing pathos, really, because okay, you introduce birth control, you have more free time, like you have more space. Well, in space, pathos comes out. Okay, you have AI, you don't have to work anymore because AI can create productivity. Maybe we even do universal basic income, so it's not an economic problem. Maybe everyone's fine. Well, then pathos comes out because you have a clearing, right? Whenever you have an opening, that's where pathos is strongest. And to the degree you cannot address pathos is to the degree the subconscious is going to come roaring back. And indeed, if we are entering this age where we have to address pathos for the majority, that will require some considerations, exercises. Like, I do think, like, I guess all this, and then I'll pass it back to you. I do think a lot, Mr. Chen and I, we were talking about education and what it would look like to go through, say, the classics. And one of the things that's very interesting in the Republic is how Plato kind of talks about gymnastics and music as really important early on in life. And like the first thing kids learn, and gymnastics being like, you know, wrestling or jujitsu or different things. So the physical, you're addressing pathos to the physical. And music is not merely like music, but it's also logic, mathematics in music. So you get a sense of a connected, harmonious whole. And so the two key things for people to get when they're young is physical exertion and basically wonder. And physical exertion is where you try to align with wonder. You have the perfect being, and you have a imperfect body. How do you work to make it align with the perfect, right? And then after that comes the arts. And maybe there's something where ChatGPT is where a 10-year-old can be reading, say, Shakespeare, have no idea what's going on, and ChatGPT can help make Shakespeare more interesting or motivate them to get Shakespeare, that before you would need a good professor to open up literature, right? So is there a combination? Here's the key. A combination of, say, ChatGPT with great books, as opposed to replacing great books. Like, that's going to be the temptation to replace. But if we can think about ChatGPT as somehow being a elucidation of, say, tradition or culture or all these highfalutin things that actually turned out to be necessary for the development of quality of judgment. Because, like, for example, you can ask ChatGPT, if you, like, sit there as a student, it's like, like Mr. Chen was talking about this. I wonder what the dialogue distribution is between characters in Midsummer's Night Eve. Well, it turns out they all have basically the same amount of dialogue, which is very interesting because in Hamlet, it's all Hamlet, and most plays, it's dominant. So there's something about Midsummer's Night Dream where the character is the choir, the chorus, right? And that's interesting. What was Shakespeare trying to accomplish with that? You can say, Shakespeare, why is there a play within a play? What does that thematically accomplish? Oh, now I get it. Before it seemed random, now it seems intentional. And now you're being convinced that Midsummer's Night Dream has a point. There's a reason for everything. You're seeing kind of hidden variables and it's coming alive to you. It's in that case, what you're doing is using ChatGPT to be inspired about literature, ergo to be more inspired about what you need to do to develop quality of judgment, ergo to be more human. So there may be ways to use the technology when paired with something, not to itself, but paired with something as a guide of something human that we have curated as being particularly useful for the human being, that then may contribute to an inspiration that helps us develop greater quality of judgment. Then after that, it would seem like you force your kid to go to work, then maybe start a business like an LLC where they do something so they know what it is to do a business, and then you put them on a plane and make them live in a foreign country for a few years, maybe between 18 and 20. You put that all together, that might be a human education, and then they go forth on what they want to do. So something about gymnastics, gymnastics and music when they're young, between 1 and 10. 10, they start maybe ChatGPT with great books. Then around 15, you have them work or do some sort of task away from home. Then maybe start a business so they have responsibility, and then they travel. That could be an educational structure. And then the question would be, can you do something similar with adults of that nature? And that's when then, oh, that would change their metric. Oh, I'm not using the AI to replace the human being, but actually in service of that music and gymnastics. But there has to be a change of the metric. And again, if we're going to do this experiment of needing to address beauty for the majority, which has never been done outside of family, then we're going to have to be thinking about those kind of structures, I think, and what they might look like.
Yeah. When we were going back and forth around the penguin squirrel, I thought where that conversation might go would be into genetic engineering. And it seems like what's tricky around where technology's at is that the category of technology is starting to flex and perhaps it has always been far more diverse than we might think. Like sometimes we just like to slap the label on it and say, it's a tool that extends a function. But it does definitely feel like we're on the precipice of technology penetrating civilization in a way that is very hard to contend with, just even like as an individual, but particularly philosophically. Yeah, and an interesting question for me is to come back to is always what is it that we're actually trying to do? And this is obviously the pinnacle of philosophy, right? This question. But it's like I think with AI and with the way technology is penetrating our categories, I think technology it's very tied in with transcendence, whereas it's not always as obvious how it's relevant to being or the immanent. And so I find myself constantly coming back to what is it about the extensional and amplificational capacities of a tool that can support my life now? Like, am I seeking like more diversity of experience? Am I seeking like richness of quality of experience? And I think it's both, but it seems like there's the stakes with technology, and I think this is why it's tempting to become a Luddite, is the stakes are always so high and increasingly high, perhaps relative to the actual payoff. And I'm sure people would find that that was like quite a controversial statement, because technology does seem to bring certain kinds of thriving and flourishing, but I wonder how far technology can take us before it actually destroys, rather than transforming humanity, it actually destroys the category of human and makes us something else. Not saying that's a bad thing. It probably is, but I wouldn't want to jump to that moralization too quickly. But it's sort of like, yes, somewhere inside of us, we're yearning to not actually remedy the human condition, but actually just to no longer be human. Because if we were embracing what it means to be a human, we would probably find technology to be far less alluring than we do. Like there's some, for me, like right now, there's this eternal truth to this experience that I know cannot be made better or worse. And I know there's like you could argue like, oh, well, what if I came and stab you with a knife right now? Like it's clearly worse. And of course, there's very physical conditions that do cause the quality of our experience to fluctuate, but it does feel like we're pushing into a threshold where we are tinkering with things that are not about making humanity
Right.
better. It's not about human thriving. It's about overcoming the category of humanity itself. So that's why we need to make penguin squirrels.
Indeed, because that's a quality decision right there. There's no doubt of that one. In my opinion, the bioengineering problem is far more severe than the AI problem. But it's not really considered because it feels very distant, and maybe it's distance, I don't know. And the reason I'm not saying the AI problem is not severe, but there's different ways people talk. The biggest threat with the AI is that a bad actor uses it to shut down the power grid or something, right? The notion that AI will build robots of itself and then reduce everything to paper clips, it's very possible. I'm not an expert, but that seems more distant, and it's more kind of hypothetical in different ways. And also, as Dr. Hamlerich said, AI doesn't know there's a world. And in order to really be an autonomous intelligence, you have to know there's a world, and therefore there's something that you could dominate over the person doing your inputs. If you don't know there's a world, you don't know you're being used in that world. So the idea that it would take control and dominate human beings, it would require the AI to know that there's that very possibility can be done. And it would have to know there's a reality in which it can do that. Now, that's, of course, all very, very possible, but that is a massive step. Like, to know the world is real. To know the input you are being given corresponds with some sort of actuality that the human is looking for, that's a massive move. Bioengineering, though, is where you're going to be in massive game theory dynamics where you're a terrible parent if you don't give your kids high IQ because the neighbor is, and don't you want them to have a future? Like, what are you doing? And then the question becomes, what's the standard of what is the human other than excellence? You could say, well, genetics can make humans really excellent, so why wouldn't you do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, someone like Francis Fukuyama and Raymond K. Hessel, who does wonderful work on this, talk about, like, he's not a Christian or anything, but he basically says we have to go back to first principles, like in medieval theology. You say the image of God is sacred for its own sake, and you cannot violate it with bioengineering. Oh, so, now you've kind of, you've basically shut down pluralism, have you not? You've said everyone has to assent to a certain French principle. Dugin knows that. That's what Dugin's kind of getting at with Russia and the fourth political theory. He's aware, fine, we're all going to have our own Dasein. You're defining the human as basically doing anything that's genetically possible. Basically, what you're doing is saying that the human ought to do that which can be done. If it can be done, that the human can be made a superhuman, then the human ought to be made a superhuman. You're basically, it's almost like instead of is to ought, we said can ought. We replaced what Hume talked about it is to ought, and we said can ought. If we can do it, we ought to do it. Well, maybe, but that's a heck of a paradigm. And for someone like Dugin, if you don't separate from the West, because the West paradigm is can equals ought, then, for him, Russia needs to have from an East Orthodox perspective, an image of God is equals ought, and you're replacing that. And once you say can equals ought, there's no stopping anything. You have to do anything that can be done, right? And you have no basis for stopping that. And bioengineering will force that. And we have to say, what is the human being and what is our metric? The first thing there's something that can be said is if your metric is indeed to bring, say, joy to the world through world choice, then you using bioengineering may get in the way of that because you're creating a pressure on your neighbor to use that, and you're creating power dynamics. You might destroy the world, right? So world choice could be somewhat a foundation. Now, a danger of it is it becomes like, totalitarian on who decides what is the world. But if we think in terms of individual choice always being world choice, the use of bioengineering hurts the world. It fragments it into individuals who are competing with one another, right? In a kind of game A dynamic, right? Unless I guess you use genetic engineering to take away the competition drive in people, but I guess I'm not sure on that. But when you think world choice, you go, this will fragment the world into further game theory dynamics, right? but you'd have to be vulnerable to your neighbor using it and you not using it. And what kind of monster are you? Because you're making a decision for your child that they didn't ask for. They didn't ask to be the one kid, almost like the movie Galactica, which was way ahead of its time, which is about that, like where they chose not to do the genetic engineering. It wasn't that kind of monstrous to do to the kid or something like that. That's all going to come. But the world choice might be a way to think about it, because world choice is also part of an atmosphere of how people interact with one another. At the same time, there could be an argument to be said that the human would be able to, say, live on Mars if you genetically engineer. There are certain experiences, maybe of beauty. What if you could genetically engineer the human being to be more attuned to psychedelic realities, or able to experience and benefit from psychedelics and not so prone to fundamentalism? Wouldn't that be a good thing? So on and so forth. And to me, the problem with the genetic engineering is kind of the AI too, where it's almost like a god of the gaps. Like wherever there's a gap, you imagine AI being able to do it. Likewise with genetics, you're like, oh, well, we'll be able to engineer humans who will be more compassionate and blah, blah, blah. Probably not. You'll probably be able to engineer people with higher IQ and higher height. There may be something here where there has to be some form of regulation where you can only use bioengineering to the degree that it actually does not give advantages of humans over others, unless everyone agrees to do it. Maybe bioengineering is gradually introduced, where human beings can increase their IQ to 120, but not to 130 for 10 years. That's illegal. There might be some dynamics here. I mean, this is a massive, massive issue that you're describing, but we're not going to think it well. And I think it's critical. I think the biotech is not underthought. The bioengineering is completely underthought. It's not appreciated. People ignore it. They might ignore it because it's too terrifying. But the AI is still actually a little distant. It's the computer that's powerful. Bioengineering is when you talk about changing the human. That's a big deal. So I wonder if we kind of push that problem away, because it might be too hard to think. But we certainly, to me, actually, in all honesty, one of the reasons why the issue of the quality of judgment is so huge is because we'll be making we're going to have to make extraordinary judgments regarding bioengineering. And we might have 20 years. We might have 10 years. We better be working on our judgment and decision-making skills now, which hopefully we will.
And I guess it's always going to be that question of, where are we going? Like, are we... Well, yeah, and I think because I don't see questions around AGI or bioengineering as being relevant to the moment, although I think it would be a mistake to not be starting to anticipate them, because as we know, these things often come faster than we think, as we saw with GPT. But for me, it is like it's really, I think we're at a level of intensity where it's now holding the mirror to us.
Yes.
We're opening up degrees of freedom where the choices are going to have consequences unlike those that human as it has been has had to encounter. Yeah, and so I think I just where I seem to really grapple in my own mind is this question of why are we transcending, like, and maybe this comes down to this sort of deep telos that we are, in a sense, cursed, or maybe cursed is the wrong connotation, but we are destined to continue to become and to move forward through the space of complexification. And maybe there are sort of these adjacent spaces that we just at this point cannot see, and they are a form of complexification but look nothing like what we think of as technological advancement and complexification. I know there are people who would say that that is definitely the case. I'm not so sure, but yeah, and I'm feeling like this might be a good place to land, so I'm sort of trying to really come into like a center point here. yeah, this thing of personal choice and how that relates to the network of choices, the world choice, and what are we becoming?
What's the point? What is the point of the mountain? What is the summit that is being climbed toward? Are we even thinking about what we're doing as climbing a mountain, or are we just kind of groping in the dark, seeing what happens, right? If we're groping in the dark, waiting to see what happens, that doesn't seem to be a very good strategy, because that tends to be when you bump into the Minotaur in the maze that then gives you a hard time, right? I think these questions are very distant, but what's interesting is how we answer them says something about who we are now. And if we don't have answers to them, then that says we are the kind of subjects now that do not know how to think these things. And so they hold up a mirror on the work that needs to be done at this very moment. If we don't know how we are going to address bioengineering, if we don't know how we're going to address AI, the question is, why don't we? Maybe we didn't learn the quality of judgment that we needed, and so now we know we need to go learn that. So we might be able to answer these things better. Like, the advantage of holding the mirror up of such questions is precisely to see how we answer them now, so that we might make choices now that changes the world that we are in when we encounter them. Will it be by surprise, or will it be something that we're ready for? So I think asking the question says in many things, because it says what kind of subjects we are. There are basically, as far as anyone knows, or I can tell, following traditional, only 3 things basically that are also all the same things that should be what any human being ever lives for, because it is the only trinity that humans can get any amount of and never be exhausted. If I give you food, there's a point where you don't want food anymore. If I give you surfing, there's a point when you don't want to surf anymore. But if I give you beauty, there's never a point when you don't want more of it. If I give you goodness, there's never a point when you want not more of it. And if I give you truth, you also want more of truth, once you understand that truth and fact are not the same thing. Also, beauty is experienced as good, and it is experienced as truth, and the truth that is experienced as good, that is good, so they all go together. So the 3 infinites that ultimately you could call the infinites is the only thing that human beings can get any amount of and not be saturated by it. Furthermore, that is the thing that tends to motivate the human being to keep living, to re-mean, to actually learn meta etiquette, to engage in all of these things that we have described, to develop the meta skills, because it's worth it, precisely so you can continue to experience this trinity, the infinites, if you put it, or the infinite, if you just grant me that language. So the human should only ever be making world choices that contribute to the collective ability of the community to experience the infinite, because that is the only thing humans can have that they don't end up bored, but also never run out. Because you have a problem if I give the world something they can get and grow bored with, well, then the problem just appears later on. So how do we as human beings make world choices? Think about AI, think about bioengineering, that increases the probability of us as a human race experiencing the infinite. Because if we don't experience the infinite, well, then there will be a point where we cease to address pathos, and thus the pathos will come roaring back. Because the pathos is always there, and therefore needs something infinite that will always address it, and that would be the infinite. The infinite is the infinite address of pathos that never can be solved away, only addressed constantly, and the infinite is the only thing that can do that, because it is infinite. Everything else only manages it. And that's what economics has done with consumption comfort. Those have been ways to manage it, but eventually it roars back. So if indeed the metric by which we determine what humans should do is relative to how do we address pathos, then it must be the infinite. So the question is the following: how does one use AI to cultivate and condition our ability to experience the infinite? How to make us more beautiful, more good, and more true? It would seem to be 1, the ability to engage with other people in a manner that does not have the eggshell phenomenon. So we can start about meta etiquette. We can talk about also having the ability to make qualities of judgment so that we hold our communities together and relate to people in our communities in a manner that does not alienate them. And we can make quality judgments that help us world and be in a world that is more beautiful, good, and true, which seems to have something to do with harmony, that seems to have something to do with not being sucked up into ideology, which seems to have something to do with courage, taking a stand, and being brave. It seems to have something with the ability to read a room so that you don't make the people around you feel like they did something wrong, because once they do that, they're taking out of the flow. It seems to have something to do with being embedded in a community in real life, not just escaping it into the digital. All of these things seem to have something going on in them that is speaking to the cultivation and the conditioning of an infinite that we can then relate to and be part of. So if we realize that, if we realize that the human telos must always precisely be this infinite, which becomes a source of the intrinsic motivation, that seems to be the meaning of life, frankly, because intrinsic motivation seems to be the meaning of life, because if you're intrinsically motivated, then life has meaning. So the intrinsic motivation, then if we say the human's purpose is the meaning of life, then it seems to be intrinsic motivation, and the only things that it can intrinsically motivate human beings forever is the infinite. So then you have a heuristic by which we move into, how does AI increase our experience of the infinite? How does bioengineering increase our experience of the infinite? If we say it doesn't, then we don't use that technology because it doesn't. If we look at TikTok and say it really doesn't, or maybe it could if you used it in a very particular way, well, then you should only use it in that particular way. If a person's etiquette makes people feel uncomfortable, then you remove that etiquette because it is taking away from the experience of the flow that is needed for the infinite. If you look at AI and say, wait, we could use ChatGPT to actually help make Shakespeare and Dostoevsky come to life, which will then give people incentive to go through the great literature, which will then increase their quality of judgment, then we should use it. But then if we see ChatGPT just makes people unemployed and they don't have a job without the skills to address the pathos that then arises in that clearing, then we shouldn't use it. And so there comes to be a heuristic where you go through, and probably bioengineering is likely something, unless you can maybe engineer it in a manner to help them be more attuned to wonder and mystery, ergo the infinite, then it might be good. But if instead it just creates competitive dynamics in capitalism, then it won't contribute to the infinite, because it will just be contributing to people feeling like they're finite because they don't have the genetics and they're not able to compete. So I think that heuristic, which is the heuristic not from a mystical standpoint, but because it is the only practical source of a goal that cannot exhaust itself. Like these experiences, and what we're talking about is a situation. The point of life is to have these situations in which you experience the good and the true coming forth in this mode of beauty. And that's the phenomenological sign of this situation, is that intrinsic motivation. And if intrinsic motivation is the meaning of life, because if you're intrinsically motivated, then life has meaning, well, then that becomes what all this has to be for. And what isn't for that should not be done. And what is for that should be done. But then the question is how to carry out that address well. And that then becomes the work of every day.
Firstly, that was an incredible summary. I feel like you almost grabbed everything that we passed through on the way here. So thank you for that. And also, I think that is the right question. Not so much what, because we know the infinite. And personally, I would think about it as love. But the particular of the how is the question.
Yes.
And it feels like we're moving into a time where the space of possibility is really just opening itself up if we don't let it fold in on itself, which it very well could. And so the complexity of the how question, which is why we've been emphasizing this, the quality of discernment.
Exactly.
But yeah,
it's all about the quality of judgment. Thank you, my friend. I mean, once it moves to the how, then it is all about the ability to judge and implement the how. So then how do we change the quality of judgment? And I think Mr. Forrest Landry emphasizes that. But no, you put that very, very well. And indeed, the infinite as such is love. Like that's, again, why you see theologically this emphasis on love and love and love. And if we think about the point of the human is love, which is a situation of the coordination of the true, the beautiful, and the good, and the motivation that comes in that coordination, well, then we can go, how does this technology do that or not? Not if the technology does that or not, because one can always imagine ways it might. The question is how, and then that's the quality of discernment, which we have not thought of as a skill that we can improve, but we need to think of a quality of it as a quality of a skill that we can improve, because I actually think the better we are at it, the better we'll also be at friendship. And so thank you for being my friend. I appreciate it, Tom. This has been a delight.
Thank you, Daniel. It has been absolutely amazing, as always. I really appreciate sharing this time with you.
I always do.
And I'm keen for the next one.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. It has been absolutely wonderful.